He pointed at her like she was something that had crawled off the wrong train. "That is not the woman I wrote to." Harold Finch's voice cut across the platform loud enough that every head turned. He didn't lower it. He wanted them to hear. "You told me you were a handsome woman. You said nothing about this." His hand swept up and down, slow and deliberate, taking in all of her. Clara Wrenfield stood with her battered suitcase at her feet, and her mother's recipe book pressed to her chest, and she did not move. "I will not be made a fool of in front of this town." He pulled an envelope from his coat and held it out. "Take the money. Get back on the train. Go back to wherever you came from." Platform went quiet except for someone laughing short and mean, cut off fast. Clara looked at the envelope. She looked at his face. Then she set her suitcase down, very carefully, and straightened up. She did not take the money. If this story already has you feeling something, stay right here. Subscribe to this channel and hit the like button so you never miss what happens next. Drop your city and country in the comments below because I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that train platform in Red Willow, Montana, and find out what a woman like Clara Wrenfield does when the world decides she isn't enough. The morning Clara arrived in Red Willow, the sky was the kind of pale October blue that looks beautiful and means nothing. She had been on trains for 4 days. Her back ached in ways she couldn't name. Her dress was wrinkled past fixing, and she had eaten the last of her packed bread somewhere in Wyoming because she hadn't wanted to spend money at the dining car. She had $43 left in her purse, 2 changes of clothes in her suitcase, and her mother's recipe book wrapped in a piece of oilcloth and tucked under her arm like it was something sacred. She supposed it was. Her mother had written in it with a stub of pencil, cramped and careful, pressing hard because she didn't want anything to fade. Measurements, temperatures, timing, little notes in the margins. "Don't rush the biscuits, Clara. Patience is the ingredient, the kind of knowledge that doesn't come from books." Clara had added her own notes over the years, her handwriting looser, fitting around her mother's where there was space. The book was falling apart. She had stitched the spine twice. She wasn't getting rid of it. She had spent 6 months writing letters to Harold Finch. He had written back, and she had read those letters more times than she would ever admit to anyone. He had described his ranch, his acreage, his cattle operation. He had written about Montana winters and the way the mountains looked in the morning and how a ranch without a woman in it felt hollow in ways a man couldn't always explain. He had not once described what he expected her to look like. She had not asked, and he had not said, and somewhere in that silence, she had let herself believe it didn't matter. She had been wrong. She knew it the second she stepped off the train and saw his face. He had been watching the platform with his hat pushed back and his arms crossed, the posture of a man waiting for something good. When she came down the steps, when he actually looked at her, something in his expression shifted. Not surprise. Something worse. Disappointment so complete it had already curdled into contempt before she reached the bottom step. She watched him make the decision. She saw it happen, straightened up. He pulled his hat down, and then he opened his mouth and let everyone within 30 feet hear exactly what he thought. "That is not the woman I wrote to." Clara stopped walking. She had imagined this moment going wrong in a dozen ways during those 4 days on the train, him being cold, him being awkward, him taking one look and needing time to warm up. She had not imagined this. Not the volume. Not the hand sweeping over her body like she was livestock at auction. Not the faces turning. A woman in a green coat pressed her lips together. 2 men near the luggage cart exchanged a look. A boy of maybe 12 stared openly until his mother grabbed his arm. "You told me you were a handsome woman," Harold said. "You said nothing about." He paused, and the pause was worse than the words "this." "I said I was capable and hard-working," Clara said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I said I was good-tempered. I don't believe I used the word handsome. Don't play word games with me. I'm not playing anything. You deceived me." His voice climbed. "I brought you out here in good faith, paid your train fare, and you show up looking like I will not be made a fool of. Do you understand me? Not in front of this whole town." He reached into his coat and pulled out an envelope and held it toward her. "Take the money," he said. "Get back on the train." Clara looked at the envelope. She thought about $43. She thought about Philadelphia, which was 3,000 miles away and didn't have a job waiting for her either. She thought about her mother's handwriting in the margins of the recipe book. Patience is the ingredient, and she thought about the fact that she had not come all this way to turn around because a shallow man with good. Penmanship had decided her body was a disappointment. Put her hand on her suitcase handle. She picked up the suitcase. She walked past Harold Finch without taking the envelope. "Miss," he turned, caught off guard. "Miss, I'm telling you." "Thank you for the letters," Clara said, and she kept walking. She heard him sputter behind her. She heard one of the men near the luggage cart make a sound that might have been a laugh, quickly buried. Her face was burning, and her eyes were absolutely dry because she was not going to cry on that platform. Not with all those people watching, not for Harold Finch. She made it to the far end of the platform before she allowed herself to stop and breathe. The town of Red Willow spread out below the station one main street, a general store, a feed store, a hotel with a painted sign, a blacksmith, a handful of other buildings. A working town, not pretty. She stood there with her suitcase and her recipe book and $43 and no plan whatsoever, and she looked at it. "You got somewhere to go?" The voice came from a woman sitting on a bench at the platform's edge, heavyset herself, 50-odd years, wearing a canvas apron over her dress and watching Clara with the frank interest of someone who had seen plenty and was prepared to see more. "Not exactly," Clara said. "I'm Dora Pittman. I run the hotel." She nodded toward the painted sign. "I've got a room, $3 a week. It's not much." "Is there work in town?" Dora considered her. "For a woman your size?" Clara met her eyes. "For a woman who can cook." Something shifted in Dora's expression. Not warmth, exactly more like recalibration. "What kind of cooking?" "Any kind. Large scale. I managed the kitchen at a boarding house in Philadelphia for 7 years. 22 residents, 3 meals daily. I can preserve, I can smoke, I can stretch provisions through a winter." Dora looked at her for a long moment. "Harold Finch is an idiot," she said finally. "He's a man who knew his own mind," Clara said. "He just knew it out loud." Dora snorted. Something almost warm crossed her face. "Come on, then. I'll show you the room. Can't promise work right away, but—" She stood up, smoothing her apron. "A woman who can cook is never entirely without options. Not out here." Clara picked up her suitcase and followed. She did not look back at the platform. The room Dora gave her was small but clean: a bed, a washstand, a window that looked out at the back of the feed store. Clara sat on the edge of the bed with her suitcase between her feet and let herself feel it for exactly 5 minutes. The humiliation, the exhaustion, the specific weight of having let herself hope, and then having that hope treated like a thing to be embarrassed by. She let herself feel it. Then she opened her mother's recipe book and read the first page. A cook's job is not to impress, her mother had written in that cramped, careful script. A cook's job is to feed. There is no more honest work in the world. Clara closed the book. She washed her face at the washstand. She went downstairs and asked Dora if she could look at the hotel kitchen. She was not going back to Philadelphia. The next 2 days were harder than she expected. Red Willow was a small town, and small towns moved information faster than telegraph wire. By the morning after Clara arrived, half the people she passed on Main Street already knew who she was. She could see it in the way eyes slid sideways, the way conversations shifted register when she walked by. The woman from the train, Harold Finch's rejected bride. The woman who didn't get back on the train. She heard things said within earshot that people could have chosen to say more quietly. She heard that fat woman twice before she'd been in town 3 days. Kept her face composed, and her pace even, and she did not answer any of it, because she had learned years ago that answering gave people the reaction they were looking for, and she was not in the business of giving people what they wanted, when what they wanted was her shame. She cooked 2 dinners for Dora's hotel, straightforward meals, nothing fancy, the kind of food that fed tired people quickly and well. Dora paid her $1 each time. It was money, but it wasn't enough, and the hotel kitchen already had a girl who came in mornings, and Dora wasn't looking to displace her. On the 3rd day, Clara asked Dora plainly whether there was anyone in the area who needed a cook on a sustained basis. Dora thought about it for a while. "There's Gideon Thorne," she said finally. "Who's that?" "Iron Mesa Ranch, about 8 miles out." Dora refilled her coffee cup and leaned against the counter. "Biggest cattle operation in this part of the valley. Thorne's a widower wife died 3 years back. He's got 2 kids, a 14-year-old boy and a little girl, 9, I think, and about 24 ranch hands." She paused. "His cook quit back in July. From what I hear, the food situation out there has gotten fairly grim." "Why'd the cook quit?" "The boy." Dora shrugged. "Wyatt. He was ugly to her, apparently." 14-year-old boys in grief can be ugly to people, and not everyone's willing to put up with it. What's Thorne's like? Dora took a moment before answering, which told Clara something on its own. Serious man. Quiet. He's not unkind, but he works hard and he expects hard work back, and he doesn't explain himself much. You won't always know where you stand with him. She looked at Clara directly. He might not want a woman from your situation. Might think the talk would cause him trouble. He might think that, Clara agreed. Or he might need someone who can cook. She borrowed Dora's wagon the next morning and drove the 8 miles out to Iron Mesa. The ranch was large. She could see that from the road the main house sat back from a long fence line, substantial and plain, built to last rather than to impress. The barn was enormous. There were corrals, a smokehouse, a bunkhouse stretched along the eastern side. Everything about it said money and hard work and practicality, and none of it said anybody was having a particularly good time. She pulled up to the main house and climbed down from the wagon, which took more effort than she would have liked. Her knees were not cooperating. She straightened her dress, picked up her recipe book, and knocked on the door. Nobody answered. She knocked again. A girl appeared 9 years old, round-faced, with her hair coming half out of its braid, and something that looked like dried batter on her sleeve. She stared at Clara with the unfiltered assessment that only small children managed. "Is your father home?" Clara asked. "He's in the barn," the girl said. Kept staring. "Could you fetch him for me? Are you the fat lady from the train?" Clara blinked. "I'm Clara Wrenfield. Could you fetch your father?" The girl disappeared. Clara waited on the porch, listening to the sounds of a working ranch horses, men's voices at a distance, something metal clanging in the barn. Cold, her breath made small clouds in the air. Footsteps, and a man came around the side of the house rather than through it. He was taller than she'd expected, broad through the shoulders, wearing work clothes that had been used hard. He had a face that had been outdoors for many years, not old, but weathered, with lines around the eyes that might have been from sun or from something else. He was wiping his hands on a cloth, and he stopped when he saw her. He looked at her. She waited to see what his face would do. Didn't do much of anything. He finished wiping his hands and folded the cloth and looked at her the way a man looks at something he is trying to assess accurately. "You're the woman who came out on the train," he said. "I am. Finch send you out here?" "Harold Finch has nothing to do with why I'm here," she held his gaze. "I understand you've been without a cook since July." "I'm a cook. I'm looking for work." He was quiet for a moment. "What kind of work?" "Meals for your household and your hands. Preservation and storage for winter. Kitchen management. Whatever else belongs to the role." "You managed a kitchen before?" 7 years at a boarding house in Philadelphia. 22 residents, 3 meals daily. "I can give you references if you need them, though they'd have to come by mail." He looked at her for another moment. Not unkindly. Not with any particular warmth either. Just looking. "My son is difficult," he said. "Your daughter asked me if I was the fat lady from the train," Clara said. "I've met difficult." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile. Almost a smile. "My last cook quit after 6 weeks. I don't quit easily." "What are you asking for wages?" she told him. He didn't flinch at the number, which told her either he was a fair man or he was desperate enough that the number didn't matter. She suspected both. "All right," he said. She waited. "All right, meaning, come in and see the kitchen. If you can make something out of what's in there, the job's yours." He turned and went up the porch steps, and she followed him into the house. Kitchen was a disaster. She didn't say so out loud. She walked through it slowly, opening the pantry door, checking the dry goods, examining what was left in the smokehouse, looking at the stove. The stove was good iron, large, well-built. Everything else was in disarray. The flour barrel was almost empty. There were onions and potatoes and some dried beans, a side of beef that had been hacked at carelessly, salt and pepper, and very little else. Someone had been cooking from desperation rather than from any real knowledge. Gideon Thorne leaned against the doorframe and watched her without speaking. "What time do your hands come in for supper?" she asked. 6 o'clock. She checked the light through the window. It was a little past noon. That's enough time. She set her recipe book on the counter. "Go back to your work. I'll call when it's ready." He didn't move immediately. He looked at the recipe book, then at her. "Sure?" "I've been cooking since I was 11 years old," Clara said. "I'm sure." He went. She tied her hair back, rolled up her sleeves, and started. It wasn't about showing off. She knew better than to reach for something complicated with limited supplies. The point wasn't to impress, the point was to feed people well with what was actually there, and that was a different skill, a more honest one. Cut the beef into chunks and got it browning, built a stew with the onions and potatoes and beans, added the little bit of dried herbs she found at the back of the pantry. She made biscuits from the last of the flour, working the dough until her arms ached. She found some dried apples in the back of the storage and got them soaking. And by 4 o'clock, she had something going on the stove that smelled like actual food. The girl Maisie appeared in the kitchen doorway around 4:30. Clara looked up. "You can come in if you want." Maisie came in slowly, keeping to the wall. She climbed up on the bench near the window and sat watching. "Why does it smell different?" she asked. "Different from what?" "From how it usually smells." "How does it usually smell?" Maisie thought about this seriously. "Like burning," she said. Clara turned back to the stove. "Well, it's not going to smell like burning tonight." A long silence. "Then are you going to stay?" "That depends on your father." "He'll say yes," Maisie said with the certainty of a child who had been watching her father closely. "He's tired. He doesn't know what to do about supper. He seems like a man who knows what to do about most things." "About cattle," Maisie allowed, "not supper." The ranch hands came in at 6:22 of them, filing into the dining room with the wariness of men who had been let down by too many bad meals and had stopped expecting otherwise. Clara had the stew in a large pot on the table, the biscuits in a cloth-lined basket, the roasted carrots and turnips on a platter, and the apple cobbler in the oven for after. Stood by the kitchen door and watched. The first man lifted the ladle, served himself, sat down. He ate a spoonful. He didn't say anything. He ate another. He looked up at nobody in particular and reached for a biscuit. That was all Clara needed to see. Gideon came in last, standing at the head of the table. He looked at his plate. He ate without apparent hurry, and she watched him from the kitchen doorway the way a craftsman watches someone encounter their work for the first time. Wyatt, she recognized him from his father's description, was 14, with his father's build and a closed-down expression that he wore like a wall. He sat at the far end from Gideon and served himself in silence. He ate. After a moment, he reached for a second biscuit without looking up. Maisie was sitting next to her father and eating with the focused energy of someone who had been given real food after a long time without it. "More," she announced, holding out her bowl. The table laughed, not at anything in particular, just the laugh that comes when a room has been tense for a long time and suddenly isn't. Gideon looked down the table and met Clara's eyes through the kitchen doorway. "It's good," he said simply. Clara nodded and went back into the kitchen to dish up the cobbler. She didn't let herself feel the relief until her back was turned. He found her washing up after everyone had gone. "The job's yours," he said, leaning against the doorframe the way he'd done before. "If you want it, I want it. Room and board and the wage we discussed." He paused. "The room's small. It's off the kitchen. That's fine." He was quiet for a moment. "There's things about this kitchen that aren't right. I know that. The supplies have gotten low and I haven't had the time to. I'd like to do a full inventory tomorrow," Clara said. "I'll make a list of what's needed." He nodded. Another pause. He seemed to be a man who thought before he spoke, which she appreciated after Harold Finch, who had not thought at all. "The things people are saying in town," he said, "about what happened at the station. Kept washing the pot. I'm aware of what they're saying. It won't be easy, Mr. Thorne." She set down the pot and looked at him directly. "I've been heavy my entire adult life. I stopped waiting for things to be easy a long time ago." She picked the pot back up. "What I'm interested in is whether the work is solid, whether you're fair, whether this is a house worth working in." He considered that. "I try to be fair. Then we'll get on fine." He straightened up from the doorframe. "Breakfast is at 5:30. Hands start early. I'll be up at 4:30. He left. She finished the washing and dried her hands and stood in that disorganized kitchen for a minute by herself. She looked at the stove. She looked at the nearly empty pantry. She thought about what she'd seen in the smokehouse, the poor preservation, the waste, the chaos of a large operation with no one minding the details. There was a lot to fix. She was good at fixing things. She picked up her mother's recipe book from the counter, tucked it under her arm, and went to find her room. Morning came fast. She was up at 4:15, which was earlier than she'd said, but she'd never been good at sleeping in new places. Kitchen was dark and cold. She lit the stove and got it going, and stood over it while it heated, drinking the first cup of coffee of the day and making herself a list in her head. By 5 o'clock, she had biscuits in the oven and eggs in the pan and bacon that had been smoked too long and had a faint off smell that she noted and did not serve. She used the rest of the salt pork instead. The hands came in at 5:30 and ate without complaint, which was progress. Wyatt came down late 6 o'clock, after everyone else had cleared, and stood in the kitchen doorway, looking at her with the particular expression of a teenage boy who has decided not to be impressed by anything on principle. "Breakfast is at 5:30, Clara said, setting a plate on the table. "I know. Then you know you're late." He looked at the plate. He sat down and ate standing at the counter instead of at the table, which she suspected was a statement of some kind. She let it go and went back to washing up. "You burned the bacon," he said. "I threw the bacon out. It was past using." "That's salt pork." A silence. "It tastes the same. It tastes similar. There's a difference." He ate the rest without comment and put his plate in the wash basin and left. Clara watched him go, then turned back to her work. Round one, she thought. Not won, not lost. She'd been doing this long enough to know that 14-year-old boys in grief weren't looking for someone to like. They were looking for someone to stay. Those were very different things, and only one of them was something she could actually offer. She stayed. She did the inventory that afternoon, while Gideon was out with his hands. She walked through the kitchen, the pantry, the smokehouse, the root cellar, the granary everywhere food was stored or purchased or processed. She had brought a small notebook and she wrote down everything she found, every quantity, every condition, every price mark on the few receipts she could locate. What she found concerned her. Not immediately, not in a way she could name yet, but there was a pattern in the numbers that felt wrong. The quantities on hand didn't match the quantities that seemed to have been purchased. Not dramatically. Not enough that a busy man running a large cattle operation would catch it in passing. Consistently, quietly, over time. There was less than there should have been. She made note of it and kept looking. By the time Gideon came in at sundown, she had a list of what needed to be purchased: flour, cornmeal lard, dried beans, salt, more potatoes, fresh smoking wood for the smokehouse, vinegar for preserving, and she had a separate page of questions she needed to ask him about his suppliers and his accounts. She set both pages on the kitchen table when he sat down. He looked at the supply list first. "This is a lot. You're about to head into winter with a full crew and not enough food to get through February. You'll need everything on that list, and probably more." He looked at the second page. "What are these?" "Questions." She sat across from him. "About your supplier. How long have you been buying from Eldon Marsh's store?" 3-4 years. "Do you review the invoices yourself?" "I sign them. I don't always have time to." "Who receives the deliveries?" He looked at her. "My foreman, Hector, or whoever's available." "Is the delivery count verified against the invoice at the time of delivery?" Pause. "Not always. Hector does his best, but he's got 100 other." He stopped. He looked at the questions on the page more carefully. "Why are you asking this?" Clara put her hands flat on the table. "Because the quantities I found in your storerooms don't match what the invoices say you've received. Not by a little. By enough." She met his eyes. "I could be wrong. I don't have complete records. But I think someone has been delivering you short, Mr. Thorne, and charging you full price." The kitchen was quiet. Gideon sat very still, looking at her. "How much?" he said. "I'd need to see more records to tell you exactly. But over a season," she hesitated, thinking through the numbers. "Potentially a lot." He stood up from the table. He walked to the window and stood there looking out at the darkening yard. She waited, because this was the kind of news a man needed a moment with. "Why would they bother?" he said finally. "I'm one customer." "Maybe not just you," Clara said. He turned and looked at her. "I'm not saying that's it," she added. "I'm saying it's possible. I'd need to look more carefully before I could say anything for certain." He was quiet for a long time. Then he came back to the table and sat down, picked up the supply list and the question page, and looked at them both. "All right," he said. "What do you need from me?" "Your invoices. As many as you have. And your ledger, if you keep one." "Keep one." "Good." She folded her hands. "I'll need some time to go through it. A few evenings." He nodded. He was looking at her differently than he had that afternoon on the porch, not with more warmth, exactly, but with something she recognized as recalibration. The same thing she'd seen on Dora Pittman's face at the station. "You came out here for a cooking job," he said. "I came out here to work." Clara said. Cooking is part of it. This is part of it too. He picked up his fork. Supper ready? It's on the stove. He went to serve himself, and Clara went back to her notebook. And outside the kitchen windows, the Montana dark came down fast and cold the way it did in October, like a curtain being pulled. She wrote down the numbers again. They still didn't add up. The invoices were worse than she'd thought. Gideon brought them to her in a tin box, 3 years of receipts, folded and creased, and some of them water-stained, stuffed in without much order. He set the box on the kitchen table after supper on the second evening and didn't say anything, just put it down and went back to his ledger that he'd already carried in and set beside it. You don't have to stay, Clara said. I want to understand what you're looking at. She didn't argue. She pulled the box toward her and started sorting. It took her the better part of 3 evenings to go through everything properly, sorting by date, cross-referencing delivery records against invoice amounts, comparing what Gideon had paid against what she'd found in the storerooms and what the natural rate of consumption for a crew this size should have been. She built her own columns in her notebook, neat and careful, and she checked her arithmetic twice because she was not going to bring Gideon Thorne a set of numbers she wasn't certain of. What she found was not a man making obvious mistakes. That almost would have been easier. What she found was a pattern so quiet and so consistent that you would never catch it looking at any single invoice. A barrel of flour listed as 50 pounds, delivered as 42. Case of salt pork listed as 12 pieces, delivered as 10. Dried beans, cornmeal, lard, all of it, slightly short. Month after month, never short enough in any single delivery to make a man stop and question it, but adding up over a season to a number that made Clara sit back in her chair and press her fingers together. She did the calculation 3 times. Then she showed Gideon. He sat across from her at the kitchen table, with her notebook open in front of him, and he looked at the final column for a long time without speaking. His jaw was tight. She could see the muscle working. That's over $200, he said. Since spring, yes. Possibly more if the pattern goes back further, but those are the records I have. Over $200. He said it again like he was testing the words. And Hector never. Hector is receiving 40 or 50 items at a time with men waiting on him and work to get back to. He's counting heads on cattle, not weighing flour sacks. She kept her voice even. This wasn't careless. Whoever is doing this knew exactly how distracted a busy foreman would be. Gideon closed the notebook. He put both hands flat on the table, which she was starting to recognize as something he did when he was working very hard to keep himself controlled. Eldon Marsh has been supplying this ranch for 4 years. I know, I've shaken that man's hand. I know that too. He stood up from the table and walked to the window and stood there. Outside it was full dark, and the yard lights were the only things visible. She waited, because there was nothing useful she could add right now. Sometimes if a person... What do you want to do with this? He said finally, without turning around. That's your decision, not mine. You found it. I'm asking what you think. She considered the question seriously, because he'd asked it seriously. I think you don't do anything yet. Not until you know whether it's just Marsh or whether someone else is involved. And not until you have records solid enough that you can't be argued out of. She paused. I also think you should start receiving your own deliveries for a while. Or have me do it. Someone who's going to count every pound. Turned from the window. You'd do that? It's part of making sure this kitchen runs right, she said, which is what you hired me for. He looked at her for a moment. There was something in his face she couldn't quite name, not gratitude, exactly. More like the look of a man who has been managing alone for a long time and has just been reminded that it doesn't always have to work that way. All right, he said. He pulled his ledger toward him and sat back down. Show me what you found, line by line. I want to understand it. So she showed him. They sat at that kitchen table until after 10 o'clock, which she suspected was at least 2 hours past, when Gideon Thorne normally went to bed. And he asked careful questions, and she answered them. And by the end of it, he understood exactly what she'd found and exactly why she was certain of it. He closed the ledger when they were done. He picked up her notebook and looked at the last column one more time. You've been here 6 days, he said. 8 days. He set the notebook down. How'd you learn to read accounts like this? I ran a kitchen for 7 years, and I had a landlord who tried to charge me for supplies I hadn't received, she said. You learn fast when it's your own money. He almost smiled. Almost. It came and went too quickly to be sure of. Get some sleep, he said. Breakfast crew comes in early. I know. I'm the one making breakfast. He picked up his ledger and the tin box of invoices and left the kitchen, and Clara sat alone at the table for a few minutes listening to the house settle around her. She could hear the wind picking up outside. October in Montana was not playing around. She blew out the lamp and went to bed. The rhythm of the ranch got into her bones faster than she expected. Up at 4:15, fire in the stove. Coffee, then the morning prep biscuits or cornbread, eggs, whatever protein she could build from what she had, which was getting more interesting now that she'd started reorganizing the storerooms. She'd found things in the back of the pantry that had been there long enough to be forgotten dried apricots, a crock of honey that had crystallized solid, tins of sardines from some previous cook's era. She used all of it. There was nothing in a working kitchen that couldn't be made useful if you knew what you were doing. Breakfast served by 5:30, kitchen cleaned by 6:15. Then whatever the day needed bread baking, smoking preparation, preservation work, or the increasingly involved project of sorting out the supply records. Dinner in the middle of the day for whoever was working near the house. Supper at 6. She was on her feet 14 hours a day. Her knees hurt. Her lower back hurt. She was not going to mention either of these things to anyone. What she noticed in the margins of all of it was the house. Not the building. She'd clocked the building immediately. It was solid and plain and needed cleaning more than anything else. What she noticed was the people in it and the way they moved around each other, like they'd forgotten how to be a household. Gideon ate standing half the time. She watched him pick up a biscuit from the breakfast basket, on his way through the kitchen, eating it in 3 bites over the counter while he read whatever paper he needed to read that morning. And then he was out the door. Not because he was rude, because it hadn't occurred to him in 3 years that there was any other way to do it. Maisie ate when she remembered to, which was not always on any schedule Clara could predict. She would appear in the kitchen at odd hours, hovering, and then disappear again. Wyatt ate at the table when the hands were there, because it would have been obvious if he didn't, but he ate fast and left fast and made a point of never being the last one in a room with Clara. She let all of it be for a while. She was not here to fix anyone's family. She was here to cook. The family would sort itself out or it wouldn't. But she did start leaving things. A bowl of stewed apricots on the counter in the afternoon with a small card that said supper is at 6, but these won't keep. Plate of biscuits at the table every morning instead of in a basket by the door, because a basket by the door communicated that the food was incidental, something you grabbed on your way to somewhere more important. She moved the coffee pot to the center of the table. Small things. The kind of thing that didn't announce itself. On the 11th day, Maisie appeared in the kitchen in the mid-afternoon and stood at the counter watching Clara make bread without saying anything. You can help if you want, Clara said. I don't know how. That's what helping is for. She pushed a small portion of dough toward the girl. Fold it like this. Heel of your hand. Push down. Quarter turn. Fold again. Maisie looked at the dough. She poked it with one finger. Don't poke it. Fold it. Maisie tried. She did it wrong, then did it a little less wrong, then started to get the rhythm of it. Her face changed while she worked the slightly pinched, watchful expression she usually carried. Went loose. And she was just a 9-year-old girl with flour on her hands, doing something with her hands that made sense. Why does it need to be turned? She asked. Builds the structure. Makes it hold together when it cooks. Is that why it's soft inside? Partly. The yeast does the rest. Maisie kneaded in silence for a while. Then, Wyatt says you're only here because you had nowhere else to go. Clara kept working her own section of dough. That's not entirely wrong. He says you'll leave when you find somewhere better. I go where the work is solid, Clara said. This is solid work. Maisie thought about that. He doesn't like you. I know. He doesn't like most people since Mama died. That's understandable. Another silence. The bread dough is beginning to look like it had a chance. Do you have a mama? Maisie asked. I did. She died 3 years ago. Did you stop liking people? Clara considered this honestly. I got quieter for a while, she said. I cooked more. It helped. Maisie looked at her dough. Maybe I should learn to cook. Maybe you should, Clara agreed. Wyatt's turn came on the 14th day, which was sooner than she'd expected. She was in the smokehouse in the morning. She'd started restringing the meat properly, building temperature consistent enough to actually cure what was hanging there, rather than just partially drying it when she heard him come in behind her. She didn't turn around. "You're doing it wrong," he said. "Am I? That's too low for the small cuts. They need to hang higher." She looked at where he was pointing. He was actually correct. She moved the smaller pieces without comment. "Our cook before the last one showed me," he said. He was being aggressive about it the way teenagers are aggressive, all preemptive defensiveness. "The one before Mrs. Daly. Her name was Rosa. She'd been here since I was little." "What happened to Rosa?" A pause. "She went back to her family. After Mama died." His voice went flat on the last part, the flatness of someone who has practiced saying a thing enough times that they can say it without falling into it. "She said she'd come back, but she didn't." Clara didn't say anything about that. She moved the rest of the small cuts to the higher hooks. "You know anything else about the smokehouse?" "Some." "Then come on. I could use someone who knows it." He stood in the doorway for a moment, and she thought he might leave. Then he came in, and she handed him the smoking wood without making anything of it. And they worked through the rest of the morning in the way of people who have agreed not to talk about the thing they're actually talking about. By the time they were done, the smokehouse was the best it had been since she'd arrived. She could tell by the smell darker, properly smoky, the smell of meat that was going to last. Wyatt looked at it before he left. She could see him calculating, the way she'd seen Gideon do it, assessing what had been done without giving away that he was impressed. "Supper at 6, Clara said. "I know when supper is," he said, and walked out. She let herself breathe, not won, not lost, better than yesterday. The first time she went into Red Willow after taking the Iron Mesa job, she went alone on a Tuesday morning with the wagon and her supply list, and the full awareness that people were going to look. They looked. She tied the wagon in front of Marsh's store and climbed down slowly, because the wagon was high, and her knees were not improved by the cold, and she walked in with her list in her hand and her notebook under her arm. And Eldon Marsh looked up from behind his counter with the expression of a man who was trying to decide which way the wind was blowing. Marsh was around 50, heavy through the middle, with the practiced pleasantness of a man who had been selling things to people for a long time. He smiled at her. It was a good smile. She didn't trust it. "You must be the new woman out at Iron Mesa," he said. "Clara Wrenfield. I'm managing Mr. Thorne's kitchen." "Well," he spread his hands. "What can I do for you?" She put her list on the counter. Everything on that list, measured and weighed before loading. "I'll be present for the count." The smile held, but something behind it shifted. "Of course. We always 50 pounds of flour means 50 pounds, she said pleasantly. "I'll weigh it here before it goes on the wagon." "I hope that's not a problem." It was a problem. She could see that it was a problem from the way his eyes moved just slightly, just for a second to a point somewhere past her left shoulder.
Which meant there was someone else in the store he was registering as relevant to this conversation.
She didn't turn around. She kept her eyes on him. "No problem at all," he said. She stood to that counter, and she watched every item down from the shelf and get weighed on the scale, and she verified every number against her list, and she wrote them all in her notebook. The flour was exactly 50 pounds. The cornmeal was exactly 25. Everything was exactly what it should be, because he knew she was watching. She loaded the wagon herself, with Marsh's boy helping, and she thanked Marsh politely and drove the wagon back to the ranch. On the way back, she passed 2 women from town who she'd seen at church the one Sunday she'd gone, and they looked at her on the wagon with the particular expression of women who have been talking about someone and are surprised to encounter that person looking perfectly composed. Clara nodded to them. She heard one of them say something as the wagon passed. She didn't catch all of it. She caught that woman, and she caught nerve, and she caught the laugh that followed. She kept driving. The thing about being mocked your whole life for the way your body looked was that you had 2 choices. You could spend all your energy being wounded by it, or you could spend that same energy doing something. She had figured out early which one was worth more. She was doing something. November came in hard. The temperature dropped faster than anyone expected, and the first real snow came 2 weeks earlier than the oldest ranchers in the valley said it should have. It was 3 inches, then 6, then a week of cold that kept the ground frozen. Clara was already in preparation mode. She'd been in it since October, but now she went harder working through the smokehouse to make sure everything was properly cured before the worst of winter locked them in. Reorganizing the root cellar by type and rotation date. Getting the winter meal plan on paper so she knew what she had and what it needed to stretch into. She found more gaps. Not as dramatic as the first time. Subtler. But she'd been tracking every delivery now for 6 weeks, verifying every weight and count, and there were small inconsistencies showing up in 2 deliveries that had come in before she'd started watching. The discrepancy pattern was different from Marsh's. These were items that had arrived in good count, but at a higher price than what other suppliers were charging. She added the numbers to her notebook and kept going. The supper table was different by November than it had been in October. She couldn't have said exactly when it happened. It was gradual, the way real things usually are. But Gideon had started coming to supper earlier, in the last 10 minutes before 6 rather than precisely at 6. He sat at the head of the table, and sometimes he talked to the hands about the next day's work, and sometimes he didn't talk much, but he was there. Wyatt had started sitting closer to the middle of the table instead of at the far end. He hadn't started talking more, but he had stopped leaving the moment. His plate was empty. One evening, he stayed while Gideon and the foreman Hector discussed a fence repair, not contributing, just sitting there, with his elbows on the table the way his father did, and Clara, coming in from the kitchen with the coffee pot, saw it and turned right back around before he could catch her noticing. Maisie had progressed from poking bread dough to actually helping make it twice a week. She asked questions constantly, the way children do when they've found something that interests them genuinely, and Clara answered all of them, even when the questions were strange. What would happen if you put too much salt? It would taste like the ocean. Have you been to the ocean? I grew up near it. What's it like? Loud. Bigger than you can hold in your head. Maisie considered this. I want to see it. You probably will someday. Papa says Montana is enough. Montana's a great deal, Clara said. But it's not the ocean. Gideon, who had apparently come in quietly and was standing in the kitchen doorway, with his hat in his hand, said, Are you telling my daughter Montana isn't enough? Clara looked at him over her shoulder. I'm telling her the ocean exists. That doesn't make Montana less. He looked at her for a moment, then at Maisie, then back at her. Fair point, he said, and went to wash up for supper. It was a Saturday in late November when Clara went into town for supplies and came back knowing something had shifted. She'd been in Marsh's store verifying weights, as she always did now, and Marsh's patience with the ritual had curdled into something that was barely concealed irritation when she overheard 2 men talking at the back of the store. She wasn't trying to listen. They were not being careful. One of them was Barrett Crow. She didn't know him by sight yet, but she knew the name. She'd heard it a handful of times in town, usually said with a certain weight that told you the person being named had money and knew how to use it. Crow owned the Spur Valley operation east of Iron Mesa. Cattle like Gideon, but more of it, or at least more visible. Kind of man who sat at the front of a room without being invited to. What she heard was not detailed. It was fragments Thorne's name, and winter, and something about grazing rights on the East Ridge that she almost missed. But she heard enough to understand the shape of a conversation, even when you only catch the edges of it. She heard Crow say, quietly and with the ease of a man discussing weather, he can't hold that ridge through another bad winter if he's bleeding cash. She did not change her expression. She finished her count, paid Marsh, loaded the wagon, and drove back to Iron Mesa. She went through her notebook that night after supper. Supply shortages, the inflated prices, the consistent, quiet bleeding of money from a ranch that should have been more solid than it was. She thought about Barrett Crow's voice in the back of that store. She thought about grazing rights on the East Ridge. She wrote 3 more pages of notes, and then she sat with them in the quiet kitchen and thought about what it all added up to. It was bigger than one dishonest merchant. Somebody had been planning this for a while. She didn't go to Gideon with it immediately, because she didn't have enough yet. What she had was a pattern and a theory and an overheard conversation, and that was not the same as evidence. Gideon was not a man who would act on half a picture, and she didn't blame him for that. So she kept gathering. She started asking questions in town, not obvious questions, not the kind that made people aware they were being questioned. She was buying supplies and talking to merchants, and she was a large woman who some people in Red Willow still thought of as slightly ridiculous. And that invisibility was, she had realized, genuinely useful. People said things around her that they might not have said around someone they took more seriously. She learned that 2 other ranches in the valley had lost significant winter provisions the previous year. She learned that both had been forced to sell cattle below value to stay solvent. She learned that Barrett Crow had purchased grazing leases adjacent to both properties in the spring. She wrote all of it down. She was back in the smokehouse one afternoon when Wyatt found her, and he came in with the comfortable familiarity of someone who had gotten used to the space being shared. "You've been writing in that notebook a lot," he said. "Yes." "What's in it?" "Numbers." He picked up a length of smoking twine and turned it in his hands. "Is it about the missing supplies?" She looked at him. "What do you know about missing supplies?" He shrugged, the elaborate nonchalance of a teenager who knows something and is trying to decide whether knowing it is safe. "I've been keeping my own count. Of the flour barrel. Timber." Clara set down what she was holding. "Show me." He pulled a folded paper from his jacket pocket. It was covered in pencil marks, dates, and numbers. A 14-year-old's record-keeping, not as organized as hers, but careful in its own way. The careful of someone who has been watching and not known what to do with what he saw. She looked at his numbers and her numbers side by side. They matched. She looked at Wyatt. He was watching her with the intensity of someone who had been waiting to show this to a person who would understand it. "Why didn't you tell your father?" she asked. He looked away. "He's got enough to worry about. He should know about this." "I know." A pause. "I didn't know how to say it without sounding." He stopped. Without sounding like a kid who might be wrong, he didn't answer, which was answer enough. Clara folded both papers together. "We'll go through this tonight. Both of us. And if the numbers hold up, we'll take it to your father tomorrow." He nodded. He was trying hard to look like this was a normal conversation and not one that mattered to him particularly. "Wyatt," she said. He looked at her. "This is good work." Jaw tightened. He looked away again. But he didn't leave right away, and she thought that was worth something. The storm that had been building in the northwest, all through late November, finally made its move in the first week of December. Came in overnight, faster and heavier than the almanac had predicted. Claire was up at 4:15 as always, and she knew the moment she stepped out to the porch for water that this was not going to be an ordinary day. The wind was coming wrong from the wrong direction, with the wrong smell, wet and metallic, and cold in a way that sat in your chest. She went back in and stoked the stove higher than usual and started cooking for as many people as the kitchen could feed. By 6 o'clock, the snow was coming sideways. By 8 o'clock, visibility at the yard's edge was gone. By 10 o'clock, Gideon had gotten the ranch hands in from the outer pastures, most of them, and was accounting for who was where, and the count was short. 3 men out with the north herd, Hector reported in the kitchen doorway, stamping snow off his boots. And the herd itself. They were moving them before the storm hit, supposed to be back by. He looked at the window and didn't finish the sentence. Gideon was already in his coat. Clara looked at him across the kitchen. "The food in the North Line shack," she said. "How much is there?" He stopped. "I don't know. I do. I inventoried it in October." She kept her voice level. "There's 3 days of basic provisions if they're careful. But only if the stove's working." The stove works. Then they can hold on. The question is whether the cattle can. He looked at the window. She could see him running calculations she couldn't fully follow: acreage, distance, the speed of the storm, the value of the herd against the risk to his men. The face of a man whose decisions all had weight to them. "I'm going out," he said. "Take the hot broth." She was already moving to the stove. "I'll pack it." "Clara, it'll keep them warm if you find them, and it'll keep you warm if the way back takes longer than you think." She was ladling broth into the metal containers she'd already found, and prepared because she had been watching that sky since 4 o'clock, and she had not spent 45 minutes this morning doing nothing. 2 of these. And the concentrated trail food in the left pantry, top shelf, the cloth bag. "I made it last week." He stared at her for a half second. "Go get your horse ready," she said. "I'll have this packed in 10 minutes. He went. Hector was still in the doorway. He looked at the containers in her hands and then at her face, and something in his expression shifted the foreman's careful blankness, giving way to something more honest. "You knew this was coming," he said. "I knew something was coming," she said. "I didn't know when." She kept filling containers. Go with him. He shouldn't go alone. Hector pulled his collar up and went. Clara packed the provisions, and her hands were steady, and outside the kitchen windows the Montana winter came down, like it had been saving this up for a long time. She stood at the stove, and she fed everyone who was there to feed, and she waited, and she was not going to be the kind of woman who stood in a warm kitchen while men she'd come to know froze in a field. She gave it 2 hours. Then she went to find Wyatt. Wyatt was in the barn. She found him there, because that was where she would have gone at 14 if she'd needed somewhere to be. That wasn't the house, somewhere with work to do, somewhere the animals didn't ask questions. He was forking hay, with the focused energy of someone keeping himself busy, so he didn't have to think too hard, and he looked up when she came through the barn door, with the cold blowing in around her. "How bad is it?" he asked. "Bad enough." She pulled the door shut behind her. The barn was dim and warm from the animals, the snow already thick against the small window above the stalls. "Your father and Hector went out an hour and a half ago." "I know, I saw them leave." He set the pitchfork against the wall. "They should be back by now. The storm's worse than it was when they left." He looked at her, and she could see him calculating the same things Gideon had calculated, except Wyatt didn't have the experience to keep his face composed while he did it. "I want to go look," he said. "I know you do." She had thought this through on the walk from the kitchen. "I want to go too. The question is whether we make it worse or better." She looked at the horses in stalls 4 left. The others had gone out with Gideon and Hector and the hands. "You know this land better than I do. North herd pasture, how far in good weather?" "Half hour on horseback. Maybe 40 minutes. In this?" He was quiet for a moment. "Double that. Maybe more. Depends on the drifts." She nodded. "Then we need to go now before it gets darker." She looked at the horses again. "Which 2 are best for weather?" He didn't hesitate. "Buck and the gray mare. Buck's been out in worse. Saddle them." He looked at her. Not the closed-down look he usually wore, something more open. The look of a boy who is frightened and is trying to decide whether the person in front of him is worth being frightened with. "You ride?" "Adequately," she said. "I won't embarrass myself." That was perhaps generous to herself. She had ridden in Pennsylvania trail horses, mostly nothing demanding. She had not ridden recently, and she was not light, and mounting a horse in a blizzard was not going to be one of her finer moments. But she was not going to let Wyatt go into that storm alone, and she was not going to stay in the kitchen and find out later. "Get the saddles," she said. "I'm going back for supplies." She went back to the kitchen at a near run, which hurt her knees considerably, and packed the remaining broth containers and the second cloth bag of concentrated trail food and the 2 wool blankets she'd had folded by the stove since that morning. She wrapped everything in oilcloth and tied it with kitchen twine. She pulled on her heaviest coat and her wool scarf and her gloves, and she went back out into the storm. Cold hit her like a wall. The wind was coming from the northwest at a sustained force that made walking difficult, not impossible, but you had to lean into it and commit, and every step required intention. The snow was already past her ankles and drifting in the low places. She got back to the barn. Wyatt had both horses saddled and was cinching the second girth. He looked up when she came in, took in the packed oilcloth bundle and the state of her after 30 seconds in the weather, and moved to take the bundle without being asked and tied it to Buck's saddle. "I can tie it to yours," he said. "Might be easier to manage." "Buck's more stable," she said. "Put it where it's safest." He tied it to Buck, and she approved of him for making the right call without arguing. Getting onto the gray mare was not dignified. She was not going to pretend it was. Wyatt held the mare's head while Clara got her left foot into the stirrup and hauled herself up, and the mare sidestepped with the restlessness of an animal that knew the weather was wrong. And Clara got herself into the saddle through a combination of upper body strength and stubbornness and sat there, breathing harder than she would have liked. Wyatt was already up on Buck. "You okay?" he asked. "Let's go," she said. He opened the barn door and they went out into the white. She understood within the first 5 minutes why he'd said double the time, maybe more. The wind came in gusts that changed direction without warning, and each gust drove snow horizontal, and there were stretches of 30, 40 seconds where she could not see Wyatt directly ahead of her on Buck, and could only follow the dark shape of the horse through the white. Her face was numb from the cold already. Her hands inside the gloves were holding the reins with the focused grip of someone concentrating on the single task of not dropping them. The gray mare was steady. That was something. She followed Buck without much guidance, which meant Clara could focus on staying on rather than on navigating, and she was grateful for that, in a way she couldn't quite articulate. They moved north. Wyatt knew the land. She could see that, in the way he read it, even through the storm angling around a depression, she wouldn't have spotted until she was in it, cutting across a ridge that gave them some shelter from the worst of the wind for about 3 minutes before they were back in the open. Didn't talk. There was nothing to say that the storm wouldn't eat before it reached her anyway. She fell 20 minutes in. The mare hit a drift she hadn't seen coming and lurched sideways. And Clara went off not fast, not dramatically. Just a slow, awful tipping that she couldn't correct because she didn't have the leverage. And then she was in the snow on her right side, with the cold coming through her coat immediately, and the mare standing 2 feet away, looking at her with the expression horses have when they've done something they feel neutral about. She lay there for 2 seconds. Then she got up. It was not quick, and it was not graceful. She went to her knees first, then got 1 foot under her, then the other, and by the time she was standing, Wyatt was off Buck and beside her, which she had not asked for, but which was there. "Are you hurt?" he said, loud to get over the wind. No. She took stock. She wasn't. The snow was a better landing than frozen ground would have been. Her hip would ache tomorrow, but it ached already. "I'm all right. Hold her." He held the mare while Clara got back on, and this time it was faster because she knew what she was doing and she was angry, which helped. She settled into the saddle and found her grip and nodded at Wyatt. He looked at her for a moment. Something in his face that she couldn't read in the weather. Then he got back on Buck. They kept going. Another 15 minutes, and then Wyatt pulled up and she came alongside him and he pointed ahead. She couldn't see what he was pointing at. Then the wind shifted for a second, and in the gap she saw the dark line of the line shack roof, 30 yards ahead, almost entirely buried in drift on the windward side. She could see no light in the window. Her stomach dropped. "That doesn't mean anything," Wyatt said, reading her face. "The window faces the wrong way for the wind. They'd block it." They covered the last 30 yards, and she let Wyatt get down first and go to the door because he was faster, and she trusted him in this. He knocked twice, hard. Nothing. He knocked again and shouted his father's name. The door opened from inside. Gideon was on his feet. That was the first thing she saw, and she let herself feel the relief of it for exactly 1 second before she took in the rest. The 3 missing ranch hands sitting against the far wall, wrapped in whatever was available. One of them with his hands tucked under his arms in the way of someone who has lost feeling in them. Hector near the stove, which was burning but low. The stove's wood supply was down to the last few pieces. Gideon looked at Wyatt, then at Clara. He looked like a man who has been cold for 2 hours and is managing it, but only managing it. "There's 2 of you," he said. "There's 2 of us," Clara confirmed. She was already untying the oilcloth bundle from Buck's saddle inside the half-shelter of the door. "Get that stove up. We brought wood?" She looked at Wyatt. "No," he said. "I didn't think. The bundle on Buck's left." "There's kindling wrapped in the oilcloth." He found it. She hadn't labeled it because she'd known she would be the one unpacking it, and she knew what was in it, but she had put the kindling in precisely because she'd thought about what the shack's supply might be after 2 hours of unexpected occupation. She brought the broth in. The man with the bad hands, she learned later, his name was Pete Carey. He'd been at Iron Mesa. 3 Seasons looked at the container with the expression of someone who is past hoping for things and then isn't. Clara knelt on the floor in front of him, which was difficult, and she didn't let herself think about getting back up, and she unscrewed the container and got it into his hands. "Slow," she said. "Don't rush it." He drank. His hands shook badly. "Can you feel them?" she asked. "Some." His voice was rough. "Getting more." "That's good. That's what you want." She looked at the color of his fingers. Not black. That was good. "Keep drinking." She got the second container to the other 2 hands. Gideon had taken the kindling from Wyatt and was building the stove back up. And within a few minutes, the temperature in the small shack began to shift marginally, but measurably. Fire makes a sound when it gets enough air, a particular draw and rush, and when she heard it, she let herself breathe. Gideon came and crouched beside her near Pete. He looked at the man's hands and then at Clara. "How bad?" he said quietly. "He'll keep them," she said, the same volume. "But he needs to stay warm and he needs food. Can't ride back in this." "I know. We're not riding back in this." She looked around the shack. 7 people, 1 small stove, diminishing wood, and whatever was in her oilcloth bundle. Started calculating. "What's in the shack stores?" "Not much. Some salt pork, hardtack, half a tin of coffee. That's enough." She started unpacking the concentrated trail food. Wyatt. He appeared at her elbow. He'd been quiet since they'd come in, not the deliberate silence he used at home, but a different kind, the silence of someone absorbing the fact that the thing he'd feared had turned out survivable. "Can you make coffee on that stove?" "Yes." Make it strong. Then we'll eat. He went to make coffee. She started on the trail food concentrated broth and dried meat and the fat she'd rendered into it for calories. The kind of thing that was ugly and dense and gave a cold body exactly what it needed. She got it warming on the stove edge and watched Wyatt handle the coffee with the careful attention of a boy who has decided to do a thing correctly. Gideon sat against the wall and watched his son. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The look on his face was the kind of thing a father has when he sees his child do something that surprises him. Clara went and sat near him because it was warmer near the wall and her hip was beginning to inform her of its opinions. She leaned back against the rough wood and let the shack's small warmth start reaching her. You fell, Gideon said. It wasn't a question. The mare hit a drift. You got back on. Obviously. He was quiet for a moment. She could feel his shoulder near hers, close enough that she was aware of it without it being something to remark on. How'd you know to bring all that? He gestured at the oilcloth bundle. I've been watching that sky since 4 o'clock this morning, and I inventoried the line shack in October. She looked at Pete Carey drinking the broth. I didn't know where you'd end up, but I knew if you ended up somewhere you'd need hot food. He said nothing. Also, she said, I've been feeding this crew for 2 months. I know what their bodies need. Clara. His voice was different. She looked at him. His face was hard to read in the low light, weathered and tired, but there was something in his eyes that she hadn't seen there before, not quite gratitude. Something more complicated. I owe you an honest thing. You don't owe me anything. When you first came out to the ranch, he said, I almost didn't answer the door. Maisie came and got me, and I stood in the barn for about 2 minutes, thinking about what people in town were already saying and whether I wanted to add to it. She looked at him steadily. I'm glad I answered, he said. She looked away toward the stove, where Wyatt was pouring coffee with the focused care of someone who doesn't want to spill. I'm glad too, she said. They stayed in that shack through the rest of the day and through the night. It was not comfortable. 7 people and 1 small stove in a space meant for 2, and the wood ran low again by midnight, and they had to go out in shifts to find what they could in the nearby stand of pine-dead branches, mostly. Some of it wet, burning badly and smoking too much. Clara managed the food in careful portions, not because there wasn't enough for 1 meal, but because she didn't know how long the storm would last, and she needed the margins. Pete Carey's hands improved through the night. By morning, he could move all his fingers, which she took as the best news available. Nobody slept much. Gideon's 2 other Hands brothers, named Tom and Dale Weaver, were Wyatt's age in spirit, if not in years, and they filled the long hours with stories about previous bad winters that were probably half invention. Hector sat quiet and solid the way Hector always did, and periodically went to check the horses, coming back each time with snow on his shoulders and a nod that said the animals were holding on. Wyatt sat near Clara for most of the night. Not close, not in a way that announced itself. Near. At some point around 2 in the morning, he fell asleep sitting against the wall with his chin going to his chest, and she watched him sleep for a few minutes, the close-as-a 14-year-old face going slack and young, and she felt something she didn't put a name to. She'd been careful not to try to be anything to these children that she wasn't. Not their mother. Not a replacement for whatever Rosa had been. Not the woman from the train who'd been handed a second chance and was going to be pathetically grateful for it. She was Clara Wrenfield. She was good at her work. That was the thing she had to offer, and she had been offering it consistently and without asking for it to mean more than it did. But sitting in a blizzard-lined shack in the Montana dark with a boy who had thought to count the flour barrel on his own, and had waited to show someone until he found someone worth showing, she allowed herself to think that maybe the work and the people had become harder to separate than she'd planned. Gideon caught her looking at Wyatt. She didn't turn away. He didn't say anything either. He just looked at his son sleeping, and then at her, and then back at the stove. For a while he said quietly, so as not to wake anyone, his mother used to say he was too serious for his own good. He is serious. She meant it as a worry. I don't, Clara said. Serious is useful. He just needs something to be serious about. Gideon considered that. He's been helping you in the smokehouse. He knows it better than I did when I started. He's been paying attention longer than anyone gave him credit for. Gideon turned his head and looked at her directly. In the low firelight, his face was stripped of the daylight composure, the practical distance he kept. He just looked tired and honest. I've been bad at paying attention, he said, to things inside the house. You've been managing a large operation by yourself after losing your wife, she said. You've been doing what you could do. That's a kind way to say it. It's an accurate way to say it. She shifted her weight because her hip was reminding her again about the fall. The other things can be fixed. If you want to fix them. He was quiet for a long time. The fire settled. I want to, he said. The storm broke sometime before dawn. She knew it before she could see it. The sound changed. The sustained roar of wind, dropping off to something intermittent, and then going quiet in a way that had a different quality to it than the eye of a passing storm. An actual quiet. The spent quiet of weather that has said what it came to say. She was awake to hear it, which meant she was the one who woke Gideon. She put her hand on his shoulder the first time she'd touched him, and she noted that, and set it aside and said his name quietly, and he was awake instantly in the way of a man who has been sleeping light for years. Storm's done, she said. He was on his feet in under a minute and at the door, and she was right. The sky outside was the particular white-gray of very early winter morning, and the snow had stopped, and the drifts were enormous and still but still. We can move, he said. Pete first, she said. We need to know how he does on a horse before we commit to getting everyone out. Agreed. She woke the others and gave out the last of the trail food and the coffee made from yesterday's grounds because there was nothing else, and it was thin and bitter, and everyone drank it without complaint. Pete Carey got on a horse without too much difficulty, which was better than she'd hoped. His hands were stiff, and he'd need a doctor to look at the worst finger. But he was mobile and clear-headed, and that was enough. They rode back. It took almost 2 hours through the drifts, which in some places were up to the horses' chests, and required patience and detours Clara couldn't have navigated without Wyatt and Hector knowing the land. She rode at the back of the group, which was slower and harder, and she fell once more in a bad drift and got up again without stopping the column. When the Iron Mesa house came into view, she heard the ranch hands at the front of the group make a sound, not words. Just the sound men make when they've been uncertain and aren't anymore. Maisie was on the porch. She came down the steps at a run when she saw them coming, which was not safe in the snow, and she slipped twice, and Gideon was off his horse before they reached the gate and caught her when she hit him. I waited, Maisie announced into his coat. I waited all night. I know, sweetheart, Clara said to keep the stove hot. Gideon looked up from his daughter's head and found Clara still on the gray mare at the back of the group. She hadn't said that to Maisie. She'd said it to the 2 hands she'd left behind to make sure the house stayed warm. The fact that Maisie had been the one keeping the stove told its own story. She was right, Gideon said, still looking at Clara. Clara dismounted carefully, and it still hurt, and handed the gray mare's reins to one of the hands and went up the porch steps. Come on, she said to Maisie. There are people who need hot food. The days after the storm had a different texture than anything that had come before. It wasn't that things were resolved. They weren't. Pete Carey needed a doctor, which meant a ride to Red Willow, and the North herd had scattered in the blizzard, and recovering them took 3 days of hard riding in brutal cold. The ranch was snowbound in a way that would last months, and the supply situation that Clara had already been tracking became more urgent, not less. But something in the house had shifted in a way that didn't shift back. Gideon came to breakfast and sat down, not grabbing a biscuit on his way past, sitting down with his coffee and staying until he had to go. It was small, and it was not every morning, and some mornings he was still out the door before she had the biscuits out of the oven. But the intention was different. Wyatt had stopped sitting at the far end of the table. He hadn't moved all the way to his father's end, and she wasn't expecting him to. But he'd settled into the middle, which was progress enough that she was careful not to make anything of it. One evening, about a week after the storm, she was sitting at the kitchen table with her notebooks spread around her, going back through the supply records with fresh eyes. Storm had clarified something she'd been circling. The shortages Marsh had been running, the quiet, consistent bleeding of provisions hadn't been random. She could see the shape of it now. The shortfalls had been heavier in the items that were most critical to winter survival. Flour, salt pork, dried beans. The things that mattered most were the things that were most consistently short, which meant whoever was directing this hadn't been trying to steal money. They'd been trying to starve a ranch out. She was still looking at that when Gideon came in. He looked at her face and looked at the notebooks. What did you find? Something I should have seen earlier. She turned the notebook so he could read the column she'd marked. The shortages aren't random. Look at which items are short versus which are accurate. He sat down and looked. She watched him read it, watched him understand it the way she had, the moment it went from numbers to meaning. Winter staples, he said, every time. The things that would hurt most if you ran out of them in February. He sat back. That's not a merchant running a short delivery scheme to pocket the difference. No, she said. It's not. That's someone trying to put me under. That's what it looks like. He was very still. Crow. I think Crow is directing it. Marsh is running the deliveries because he controls what goes on the wagons. She pulled out the second notebook, the one with her town observations. I heard Crow mention the East Ridge grazing rights. I didn't think much of it at the time. But I looked at your land records, the ones in the desk in the front room. I hope you don't mind. I don't mind. The East Ridge is Iron Mesa's most valuable winter grazing. If you lost it, you'd have to move the herd south, which would mean either purchasing grazing rights from someone else or selling cattle to cover operating costs until I could find alternative land. He said it flatly, working it through. And if I'm selling cattle below value in a bad winter, Crow's positioned to buy. He's done it before. 2 other ranches in the valley. Last year, he looked at her. The kitchen was very quiet. You've been gathering this for weeks, he said, since I overheard him at Marsh's store. I didn't have enough to bring you sooner. You should have told me when you first heard it. I had a fragment of a conversation and a theory, she said. I wasn't going to bring you a theory. He held her gaze for a moment, and she could see something working in his face, not anger, or at least not at her. This is more than a bookkeeping problem. Yes. This is a man who has been trying to take my land. Yes. He pushed back from the table and stood. He walked to the window and stood with his hands on the frame and looked at the dark yard, the same posture she'd seen from him the first time she'd brought him hard news. The man who needed a moment to be in it before he could think about what to do with it. She waited. After a while, he said, "What do you think we should do?" She looked at her notebooks. She had been thinking about that question for some time. Not what he's expecting, she said. Whatever we do, it can't be guns and accusations. Crow has money and influence, and he's been careful. Direct confrontation gives him room to deny it and makes you look like a man who lost his temper. She paused. What he can't deny is numbers. Documented numbers, from multiple sources, seen by enough people that the story tells itself. He turned from the window. He looked at her across the table. How do we get that? We give him a reason to think he's winning, she said. And while he thinks that, we build the case. She looked at her notebooks. But I'm going to need more information than I can gather from your records alone. I need to know if the other ranches have the same pattern. And I need someone in Red Willow who can tell me more about Marsh's arrangement with Crow. Dora Pittman, Gideon said immediately. Clara looked up. You think she knows? I think Dora Pittman knows most things that happen in Red Willow, he said. And I think she liked you from the station. He picked up his hat from the hook. I'll ride in with you next Tuesday when you go for supplies. You don't need to. I know I don't need to. He looked at her steadily. But you shouldn't be carrying this alone. She looked at him for a moment. She thought about $43 in a battered suitcase and Harold Finch's hand with the envelope extended. And she thought about how far she was from that platform and how different this felt, not easier, not simpler, but different in a way that went down deeper than she'd let herself acknowledge. All right, she said. He put his hat on and went to check the night crew, and Clara sat at the kitchen table with her notebooks and the lamp and the quiet house around her. She turned to a fresh page. She wrote Barrett Crow at the top. She wrote Eldon Marsh beneath it. She drew a line between them, and then she started writing everything she knew, and everything she still needed to find out. And she kept writing until the lamp needed refilling, and she was too tired to see the numbers clearly. She went to bed. She lay in the dark in the small room off the kitchen, and she listened to the ranch at night, the horses in the barn, the wind off the mountains, the creak of the house settling in the cold, and she thought about a 9-year-old girl keeping a stove lit all night because someone had told her it mattered. She thought about a 14-year-old boy counting flour in secret and waiting to find someone worth telling. She thought about a serious weathered man who had stood in a barn for 2 minutes deciding whether to answer his own door and had come out anyway, closed her eyes. There was a great deal of work still to do. She was not going anywhere. Tuesday came clear and brutal cold, the kind of cold that had no wind in it and therefore no apology, just the flat, hard freeze of a Montana December that reminded you the land didn't care about your plans. Clara was up at 4 as always. She had the breakfast done and the kitchen clean, and her notebooks in her bag by the time Gideon came down at 5:30. He looked at her bag on the chair by the door and looked at her and didn't say anything, just poured his coffee and sat down. Wyatt came down at 5:40, which was the earliest he'd appeared for breakfast since she'd arrived. He sat across from his father and served himself without ceremony. "You're both going to town," he said. "Not a question." "Ply run," Clara said. Wyatt looked at her, then at Gideon. He was 14 and serious, and he had counted flour in secret for 2 months, and he was not a boy who missed much. "Is it about Crow?" Gideon looked up from his plate. "I'm not blind," Wyatt said. "I've seen her notebooks. I know what the numbers mean." Clara set the coffee pot down. She looked at Gideon, and he looked at her, and something passed between them that was the particular communication of two people who have been working alongside each other long enough to have a shorthand. "It's about Crow," Gideon said. Wyatt nodded. He ate for a moment. "Then what are you going to do?" "We don't know yet," Clara said. "That's partly what today is for." "Dora Pittman?" "How do you know about Dora Pittman?" Gideon said. "Talks to everybody." "She's been talking to Clara since the station." He shrugged. The elaborate shrug of a teenager who has been paying attention and knows it, and isn't sure whether to be proud of it. If anyone in Red Willow knows Crow's business, it's her. Clara looked at this boy, this difficult, closed down, flower counting, smokehouse learning boy, and felt something she didn't put a name to. "You'll be all right here with Maisie?" Gideon asked. "Hector's here. We'll be fine." He picked up his biscuit. "Don't let Marsh short the flour again." "I never let him short anything," Clara said. Something moved at the corner of Wyatt's mouth. It wasn't quite a smile. Close enough. The ride to Red Willow took an hour in the cold, and they made it mostly in silence, which was comfortable in the way that silence between two people becomes comfortable when they've stopped needing to fill it. The road was frozen hard and the wagon moved well, and Clara sat with her hands in her lap and her notebooks in her bag and watched the Winter Valley go past. About halfway in, Gideon said, "I've been thinking about how to approach Crow." "And? You said don't confront him directly. Give him reason to think he's winning." He kept his eyes on the road. "What does that look like?" "It looks like Iron Mesa behaving exactly as it has been. You make your supply run. You pay your bills. You don't change anything that would signal to Crow you've found the problem." She had thought this through carefully over the past week, sitting at the kitchen table after the house went quiet. If he thinks the scheme is working, he won't be careful. Careful men hide their tracks. Complacent men leave them. And while he's complacent, we build the ledger. Every discrepancy documented, dated, cross-referenced. She paused. And we find out whether the other ranches in the valley have the same pattern. Because if they do, this stops being one man's complaint against Barrett Crow and starts being a valley-wide record of systematic fraud. Gideon was quiet for a moment. "Sutton Ranch. North of here, maybe 12 miles. Frank Sutton lost 40 head last February, sold them cheap to cover winter costs. I always thought he'd just had a bad season. Did he buy from Marsh? I don't know. I can find out," casually, she said. "Not in a way that gets back to Crow. I know how to talk to other ranchers without tipping my hand." "I know you do. I'm saying it because I'm nervous, not because I think you don't know your business." He glanced at her sideways. "You're nervous?" "I'm always nervous when I'm doing something I can't undo if I get it wrong," she said plainly. "That's not a reason not to do it. It's just a fact." He looked back at the road. After a moment, he said, "That's honest. I try to be. I've noticed." The town came up ahead, the painted hotel sign visible first, and then the feed store and the main street laid out in the frozen morning. Clara straightened up and put her notebooks in order and readied herself for Eldon Marsh's practice smile. She did the supply run first, because the supply run was the reason they'd come, and she was not going to let anything else make it look otherwise. She went through the count at Marsh's counter with the same methodical attention she always did, and Marsh watched her with the same barely concealed irritation he always had, and everything weighed out correctly because she was watching. While she was finishing the count, she heard Gideon at the back of the store, talking to Marsh's older stock boy about the weather, about the North Road conditions, about nothing in particular. The easy talk of men who know each other from the same landscape. Clara kept her eyes on her notebook and her ears on Gideon's conversation. She heard him ask, in exactly the right tone of idle curiosity, whether Frank Sutton had been in recently. "Not since October," the stock boy said. He switched to buying from the Caldwell outfit over in Miner's Fork. That so? When'd that happen? Spring, I think, after his bad winter. Clara wrote a number in her notebook that she already knew and didn't need to write again. Sutton had switched suppliers after a bad winter. If Marsh had been running the same short delivery scheme on Sutton, and Sutton had cut ties with him after, she needed to talk to Frank Sutton. She finished the count, paid Marsh, and left the boy to load the wagon. She found Gideon on the boardwalk outside. Sutton switched suppliers in the spring, she said quietly. After losing 40 head in February, he said, I know. I just found out something else. He kept his voice down, turned slightly away from the store window. Marsh was extended credit by Crow's Bank last March. $2,200. Harlan Greaves at the feed store mentioned it, didn't think anything of it. She looked at him. Crow owns the bank? Partial stake. Enough. He looked down the street. Marsh was in debt trouble before that. Now he's not. $2,200 to a struggling merchant, from a man who needed a cooperative supplier running short deliveries to targeted ranches. Turned that over in her mind, and it settled in a very specific shape. That's the arrangement, she said. That's the arrangement, he agreed. They stood on the frozen boardwalk for a moment in the cold. Dora, she said. Dora, he said. Dora Pittman's hotel had a small back room she used for meetings she didn't want witnessed from the street, and she took them there without being asked, which told Clara that Dora had been thinking about this moment for some time. She set coffee on the table, real coffee, not the twice-used ground situation, and sat down across from them and folded her hands and looked at Clara. You found the book, she said. You knew, Clara said. Not an accusation. A recognition. I knew something. Not specifics. Dora wrapped her hands around her cup. I've watched Crow buy up distressed properties for 3 years. I know what a man looks like when his ranch is bleeding slow and he can't find the wound. Frank Sutton had that look all last winter. She paused. I didn't have proof of anything. Just the pattern. We have proof, Clara said. Or close to it. We have Iron Mesa's records, which document systematic short delivery over 8 months. We have Gideon's invoices and my inventory records and Wyatt's independent count. She watched Dora's face. What we need is to know whether the same pattern exists for other properties, and whether anyone else was watching. Dora was quiet for a moment. She looked at Gideon. You trust her completely? Yes, Gideon said. No hesitation. Dora looked back at Clara. All right. She reached into her apron pocket and set a small folded paper on the table. I've been keeping notes, too. Nothing as organized as yours, I imagine. But names and dates and what I observed. She pushed the paper toward Clara. 2 other ranches besides Sutton. The Alderman property east of town they sold out in August, moved to Oregon. And the Kellerman place, which Crow picked up at auction in September. Clara opened the paper. Dora's handwriting was small and cramped and very clear. Kellerman bought from Marsh, Clara said, reading. He did. Right up until the auction. Clara looked at Gideon. He looked at her. 4 properties, she said. Iron Mesa, Sutton, Alderman, Kellerman, all buying from Marsh, all experiencing provision shortfalls, followed by financial difficulty, followed by either sale or near sale. She set Dora's paper down. That's not bad luck and bad seasons. That's a plan. Dora picked up her coffee. The question is what you do with it. I've been thinking about that, Clara said. She had been thinking about it for 2 weeks, turning it over at the kitchen table at night, approaching it from different angles to see which one held up. Crow has money and standing in this valley. If Gideon goes to the county seat with a complaint, Crow has the resources to bury it in lawyers for years. And Marsh will say his scale was miscalibrated, his stock boy miscounted. Whatever story makes the individual incidents look like honest error. So what do you do? Dora asked. You make it impossible to explain away. Clara set her hands flat on the table. Not one complaint. 4 all documented, all showing the same pattern, all presented together. Public. In front of the other ranchers in this valley, who all have their own dealings with Marsh and their own interests in knowing whether they've been cheated. She paused. You make it a community problem, not a personal grievance. Then it's not Crow's lawyers against one man's ledger. The whole valley. The room was quiet. Dora looked at her for a long moment. How do you get them all together without Crow knowing what's coming? You invite them to dinner, Clara said. It took 3 weeks to arrange. 3 weeks of careful, quiet work that could not look like work from the outside. Gideon rode to the Sutton Ranch 12 miles north. hard-going in December cold, and had a conversation with Frank Sutton that started as a discussion about winter grazing and ended 3 hours later, with Sutton pulling out his own records and sitting very still at his kitchen table. Same pattern, Gideon told Clara when he came back, standing in the kitchen doorway still in his coat and hat. Identical? Close enough. He was short on flour and salt pork every other delivery from March through October. He thought his count was wrong. He thought maybe his hands were taking more than he knew. He pulled off his hat. He sold 43 head of cattle in February to cover costs. Crow's broker made the offer the second week of January, before Sutton was desperate enough to know he should hold out for a better price, before anyone would have expected him to be in trouble. Gideon set his hat on the hook. He was quiet when I told him. Then he went and got his invoices. He'll come? He'll come. And he asked about his neighbor, a man named Pullman, who has a small operation on the East Fork. I told him to ask Pullman privately before we said anything more. Clara noted Pullman in her notebook. Dora is talking to the alderman's son. He didn't move to Oregon with his parents. He stayed on as a hired hand over at the Macready place. He might have records from the property before the sale. You think he kept records? I think a man who watched his family lose their ranch might have kept everything he could put his hands on. She looked at her notebook. Also, I wrote to the county land office to ask about the timeline of Crow's property acquisitions. Public record. They'll write back. Gideon sat down at the table. He looked at her notebooks. There were 3 of them now, each focused on a different thread of the same story spread across the surface in the ordered way she always arranged them. He looked at them for a moment. You've been doing this every night, he said. For supper. When the house is quiet. I didn't know. I didn't want to bring you pieces. I wanted to bring you the whole thing when I had it. She looked up at him. We're close to the whole thing. He was quiet for a moment. He was looking at her in the way he sometimes did not the assessment of the first day on the porch. Not that. Something that had developed over 2 months of working alongside each other. Something she had been very careful not to examine too directly. What do you need from me for the dinner, he said. I need you to invite people, she said. Ranchers, merchants, anyone with standing in this valley who buys from marsh or has adjacent land. I'll handle the food. You handle the guest list. The food matters. The food matters enormously. She set her pen down. People's guard comes down when they're eating something good. They're more willing to look at difficult information when they're comfortable and fed. And feeding people is what I know how to do. She paused. Also, I want to use the food that carried this ranch through the blizzard. The same dishes. The same inexpensive, well-made, honest food. Because the point of this dinner is not to impress anyone. The point is to show what Iron Mesa is. He looked at her steadily. It's still standing, she said. Crow tried to starve it out, and it's still standing. The food shows that. All right, he said. One more thing. She picked up her pen. We need to invite Crow. He went very still. If we don't invite him, he hears about the dinner afterward and knows what it was from the start. He has time to build a counter-story. But if he's there, she kept her voice even. If he's there, he can't build a story afterward that he wasn't part of. Whatever happens in that room, he's in it. Gideon thought about that for a long moment. Could see him working through the angles the way she had. He'll know something's wrong the minute he walks in, he said. He'll suspect something's wrong. He won't know what. She looked at her notebooks. And by the time he knows, it'll be too late to change anything. Gideon nodded slowly. Send the invitations on Friday, she said. I'll start cooking Thursday. The week before the dinner, Maisie developed opinions. Started with the cobbler. Clara was planning apple cobbler as the dessert reliable, warm, kind of thing that made a large group of cold people feel looked after, and Maisie appeared at her elbow one afternoon and announced that they should also do the dried apricot preserves, because some people didn't like apples. Some people don't like apples, Clarissa said. My teacher doesn't like apples. She says they're mealy. Your teacher isn't coming to dinner. You don't know that. Maisie was kneading bread dough with the concentrated focus she'd developed over weeks of practice, her hands finding the rhythm now without being told. Papa might have invited her. She's Mrs. Fenwick, and she's been here 7 years, and she knows everybody. Clara looked at her. Did your father invite Mrs. Fenwick? I don't know. I just think we should have options. Clara made the apricot preserves. Wyatt's contribution was different. He came to her 3 days before the dinner with a piece of paper that turned out to be a seating plan handwritten cross-referenced with notes about which ranchers had dealings with which, who was likely to be skeptical of what. She looked at it for a long moment. "Where'd you get this?" she asked. I thought about it. He was trying to look like this was a normal thing, a piece of information he'd assembled casually. If you put Sutton next to McCready, they'll talk to each other before the records come out. McCready's been worried about his provision costs for 2 seasons, but he hasn't said anything publicly. Sutton talking to him directly is better than anything you could say to him. Clara looked at the seating plan. It was genuinely, uncommonly smart. "And Crow?" she said. Wyatt pointed to a spot in the middle of the long table. Not at the end, where he could see everything and keep his back to a wall. In the middle, where he would be surrounded by the ranchers whose properties he'd damaged, where he would have to turn his head to see who was talking. "Your father needs to see this," she said. "I made it for you. Then we'll both take it to your father." He looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up the seating plan and went to find Gideon. The letter from the county land office arrived 2 days before the dinner. Clara opened it at the kitchen table while the breakfast dishes were still on the stove. She read it twice. Then she sat with it in her hands for a moment. The Alderman property transfer had been filed 11 days before the Alderman family completed the sale. 11 days before the auction had been formally announced. Crow's name was on the preliminary filing as interested party, which was a legal procedure except that it required knowledge of the property's availability before that availability was public. Marsh had told him. Marsh, who handled provisions for the Alderman Ranch, would have seen the shortfall in the family's winter stores. He would have told Crow when the pressure was reaching the breaking point. And Crow had filed his interest before the family even knew they were going to sell. She added this to her notebooks. She had the whole thing now. That evening, she spread everything on the kitchen table, all 3 notebooks, the invoices, Wyatt's count records, Dora's notes, the letter from the land office, the information from Sutton. She organized it chronologically and by property, and she sat back and looked at it. Gideon came in from the evening rounds and stood at the kitchen doorway and looked at the table. "Is that it?" he said. "That's all of it." He came and sat across from her. He went through it slowly, not rushing, reading each page, following the columns she'd marked. She sat quietly and let him read, because the numbers spoke better without her narrating them. When he was done, he sat back. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he looked at her. He was going to take everything, he said. He was going to take the East Ridge first. Then, when your costs climbed high enough that you couldn't service the ranch properly, he'd have made an offer on the operating land. She kept her voice steady. His pattern with the other properties ran 12 to 18 months from the start of supply manipulation to sale. You've been under it for 8 months. You had 4 or 5 months before the pressure became serious. If you hadn't found it, someone would have found it eventually. But you did. He looked at the notebooks again. You found it in 8 days. She was quiet. "I want you to run the dinner," he said. "All of it, not just the food, the whole thing. Gideon, you've built this. You know every piece of it. I know the ranchers. I know the room. I'll handle whatever needs handling in terms of who's saying what. But the structure of it, the order, what comes out when and how," he held her gaze. "That should be you. Some of those men are going to have trouble hearing difficult news from a woman they don't know. Some of them will. And then they'll look at 3 notebooks and a letter from the county land office, and they'll get over it." He picked up one of the notebooks. "This is careful work. The most careful I've ever seen." He set it down. "Run the dinner." She looked at the table covered in her weeks of work. "All right," she said. The dinner was a Saturday. 22 people. 12 ranchers, 3 from further in the valley that Gideon had reached through Frank Sutton's connections. 4 merchants from Red Willow, who had their own dealing with Marsh and their own questions they hadn't known they should be asking. Dora Pittman, the alderman's son, a quiet young man of 20 named Russell, who had come with a cardboard box of his family's records. And Barrett Crow, who arrived last, in the best coat Clara had seen in Red Willow, with the contained ease of a man who has money and is comfortable in any room. She watched him come in from the kitchen doorway. He scanned the room. His eyes moved over the assembled ranchers and merchants with the quick calculation of a man who reads rooms professionally. Then his eyes found Frank Sutton, and something shifted, a micro-adjustment in his expression, gone quickly. He knew something was different. He didn't know what. Clara went back to the stove. She had made the beef stew. She had made the biscuits. She had made the roasted vegetables and the dried bean soup with ham bone and the corn pudding. And Maisie had made 2 pans of apricot preserves with only moderate intervention. And the whole kitchen smelled like the smell that a working ranch kitchen should smell, like the smell of a place that knows how to take care of its people. She carried the first pot out herself. The room went quieter when she came in, and she knew it was partly because of who she was. Some of these men had heard about the woman from the train, the rejected bride, the fat woman Iron Mesa took in, and she let them look. She set the pot on the table and went back for the next one. By the time all the food was out, the conversation in the room had loosened. She could hear it from the kitchen the way it does when people are eating something real, when the food is honest enough that it lowers the guard a little. She listened for the temperature of the room and judged it. She gave it 40 minutes. Then she came back out and stood at the head of the table. The conversations tapered off. 22 faces turned toward her. At the far side of the table, midway down, Barrett Crow looked at her with the careful neutrality of a man who has decided to find out what this is before he reacts to it. She set her notebooks on the table. "I'm Clara Wrenfield," she said. "I manage the kitchen at Iron Mesa. I also manage the accounts." She looked around the table, not rushing. "I'd like to show you something." She started with Iron Mesa's records. She walked through the invoices and the delivery counts and the shortfalls, keeping it simple, keeping it numbered, because numbers were harder to argue with than impressions. Could feel the room's attention shift as she went, the particular alertness of people who recognize something familiar in what they're hearing. When she was done with Iron Mesa, she nodded at Sutton. Frank Sutton was a rangy man in his 50s with a permanent squint and the careful movements of someone who had been let down by enough things that he moved through the world cautiously now. He stood up and opened his own folder. He talked for 6 minutes. The room was very quiet. Then Russell Alderman, the young man with the cardboard box, stood up. He spread his family's records on the table, creased and worn from being kept through a family's loss, and talked about the winter his parents lost the property. By the time he sat down, the temperature in the room had changed entirely. Clara picked up the county land office letter. She read the relevant section, the part about the preliminary filing, the 11-day gap. She set it down in the center of the table where it could be seen. She looked at Barrett Crow. He was sitting very still in the middle of the table. His face was composed. She gave him credit. He was a man who had been doing this long enough to know how to hold himself when the ground shifted. But she could see it in the set of his shoulders, in the way his hands were flat on the table surface. He knew it was over. "Mr. Crow," she said, "you're welcome to speak." The room waited. Crow looked around the table at Sutton, at Russell Alderman, at the ranchers who were sitting with their own records in mind, at Gideon at the head of the table, watching him with the flat patience of a man who has waited a long time for this particular moment. "This is a collection of coincidences," Crow said. His voice was steady. She'd expected that. Delivery errors, misweighed goods, these things happen in commerce. Trying to build a pattern out of them. "The pattern builds itself," Dora Pittman said from 2 seats down. Her voice was dry and even. "I've been watching it for 3 years. I just didn't have the paperwork until now." "And the land office filing?" said one of the ranchers from further in the valley, a man named Caldecott, who had come as a skeptic and had gone very quiet during Sutton's account. 11 days before the public announcement. "How do you explain that?" "I had information from a legitimate source." "Your legitimate source was a merchant you'd paid $2,200 to watch which ranches were struggling," Clara said. Kept her voice even. Not triumphant, just the voice of a woman stating what the records showed. "That's not commerce. That's not bad luck. That's a plan." The room was silent. Crow looked at her across the table. Something moved in his eyes, not anger, or not only anger. Something that might have been, at a very deep level, the particular frustration of a man who had not accounted for her, who had built his entire scheme on the assumption that the people around him were not looking carefully enough to see it. He had been wrong. He didn't have an answer for the records. He sat in that room for another 10 minutes, and various ranchers asked questions that he answered with varying degrees of credibility, and the room's collective conclusion arranged itself without anyone needing to announce it. He left before dessert. Clara watched him go from the kitchen doorway. She went back in and served the cobbler. The room after Crow left was different, looser, louder, the kind of noise a group of people makes when they've been holding something tense and then don't have to anymore. Ranchers compared notes. Sutton and Caldecott shook hands over something. Dora sat with Russell Alderman and talked quietly, and Clara saw the young man nod several times at whatever Dora was saying. Marsh's business did not survive the week. She heard it from Dora on Wednesday. The merchants who'd been at the dinner had gone through their own accounts, found their own discrepancies, and by Tuesday morning, 3 of them had closed their accounts with Marsh, and the rest followed by afternoon. Without the rancher's business and without Crow's credit line, which Crow withdrew the Monday after the dinner, Marsh shuttered the store by Friday. Crow's influence in the valley contracted faster than Clara had expected. She heard secondhand from Sutton, who came by Iron Mesa in the week after the dinner, that 2 of Crow's grazing lease arrangements had been challenged by the neighboring ranchers. Whether anything would come of it legally was less certain. Money was its own kind of protection, but the social leverage he'd built over 3 years in this valley evaporated in about 10 days, which she suspected was more damaging to a man like Crow than any legal consequence. What she hadn't expected was what happened after the room cleared that Saturday evening. She was washing the big pots when Gideon came into the kitchen. The house was quiet. Wyatt had put Maisie to bed 2 hours ago, and himself not long after. The last guests had left 30 minutes before. The kitchen was hot from the cooking and smelled like soap and the remains of the evening. He came and stood near the stove and watched her work. "It worked," he said. "The records worked," she said. "I just organized them." "That's not," he stopped. Started again. "That's not what I mean, and you know it." She set the pot down and turned to look at him. He was leaning against the counter with his arms crossed and his hat off, and he looked tired in the way a person looks tired when they've been carrying something heavy and have just set it down. "You built all of that," he said. "From scratch. In the middle of running a kitchen for 25 people through a blizzard." He shook his head slightly. "I've been asking myself for 3 weeks why you stayed. After what happened at the station. After everything the town said. You could have gone to any city and found kitchen work." She dried her hands on the towel. "You asked me a fair question on the first day. I asked if you could cook. You asked it fairly," she said, "without looking me over first. You were the first person in Red Willow who asked about the work before anything else." Quiet for a moment. "Also," she said, "the work here is better than anything I'd find in a city kitchen. Problems are real. The stakes are real." She hung up the towel. "I don't do well with small work." "No," he said, "I've noticed." She looked at him, and he looked at her, and the kitchen was warm, and the house was quiet, and outside the Montana winter was very still. "Clara," he said. The way he said her name was different than it usually was, not the direct address of a working day, something more careful. She waited. He uncrossed his arms. He picked up his hat from the counter and turned it in his hands, which something he did when he was thinking through, something he wasn't sure of. She'd seen it enough times to know the gesture. "I don't know how to say this without it sounding like." He stopped. "What?" "Like I'm telling you I need you here." "Which is true but isn't." He set the hat down. "That's not what I want to say." She waited. "I want to say that I notice when you're not in the room," he said. "I've been noticing it for a while, and I don't think that's about the kitchen." He looked at her directly. "I think that's about you." The kitchen was very quiet. She had been careful, so careful about this, about what she let herself think and what she let herself feel, about keeping the work as the thing and not letting anything else complicate it. She had come to Montana for a marriage that had lasted about 3 minutes, and she had rebuilt herself out of that on a foundation of useful work and honest dealing. And she was not a woman who needed to be wanted to know she was worth something. But she also was not a woman who pretended she didn't feel what she felt. "I notice it too," she said, "when you're not in a room." He looked at her. "I'm not saying it's simple," she added. "There are 2 children and a ranch and a town that has opinions, and I have work here that matters to me for its own reasons. I know all of that. I just want to be clear that I'm not." She stopped. "I'm not here because I need to be chosen. I'm here because the work is good and the people are worth working for. That doesn't change." "I know that too." His voice was quiet. "It's not what I'm asking." She looked at him for a long moment. "All right," she said. He picked up his hat. He was almost smiling, the almost smile she'd seen 6 times over the past months, gone before you could be sure of it. "Good night, Clara," he said. "Good night, Gideon." He left. She stood in the clean kitchen for a moment, listening to the house settle. Then she blew out the lamp and went to her small room off the kitchen. and she lay in the dark and listened to the winter night outside and thought that a woman who had been pointed at on a train platform like something broken had done considerable work in the months since. Considerable work. She let herself feel that. Then she closed her eyes and slept better than she had since Philadelphia. Winter broke slow that year. The way it does in Montana, when it's been serious, not a clean ending, but a gradual, reluctant loosening. Snow pulling back from the south-facing slopes first, the creek ice going gray and rotten before it finally gave, mud season arriving in March, with the particular commitment of something that had been waiting a long time. Clara noticed spring the way she noticed most things practically. The Roots cellar inventory that had carried 25 people through December-January, and February was down to its last rotation, which meant she'd calculated correctly, which meant she allowed herself one moment of quiet satisfaction before starting the spring supply list. The kitchen was different by March than it had been in October. Not the room itself, the room was the same iron stove, the same scarred table, the same window that looked out at the yard. But the room had a different quality to it now, the quality of a place that was used properly, lived in by people who had gotten into the habit of being in it together. Maisie's apron hung on the hook by the pantry door. Wyatt's copy of the smokehouse schedule his handwriting, not Clara's, was tacked to the wall beside the stove. Gideon's coffee cup was on the table at 5:30 every morning, filled and waiting, because Clara had started making it that way without deciding to. Small things. The kind of things you don't notice accumulating until you step back and see what they've built. She was making the spring supply list on a Thursday morning, in late March, when Dora Pittman came out from town in her own wagon, which, was unusual enough that Clara looked up from her notebook when she heard the wheels on the frozen mud of the yard. Dora came in without knocking, which by March was not strange. Dora had been to Iron Mesa 4 times since the dinner and had developed the comfortable directness of a woman who had decided the formalities were wasted between them. She sat down at the kitchen table and took off her gloves and looked at Clara. "I have a proposal," she said. "Coffee first," Clara said. Coffee and then the proposal. Clara poured. Dora wrapped her hands around the cup and sat for a moment, and Clara let her sit, because Dora was not a woman who needed prompting. She arrived with things already organized and delivered them when she was ready. "Frank Sutton came to see me Tuesday," Dora said. "He's been talking to 3 other ranchers about their winter kitchen situation. Not just provisions, the whole thing. Organization, preservation, rotation planning." She paused. "They want to hire someone to come out and consult. Set up their kitchens the way Iron Mesa runs now." Clara set down her pen. "Set them up, they want you specifically. Sutton talked about what you did with Iron Mesa's stores through the blizzard. Caldecott heard it and talked to the Harmon place, and the Harmon place talked to somebody else. And now I've got 4 ranches asking whether the woman who runs Gideon Thorne's kitchen would be willing to come out and help them get sorted for next winter." Clara looked at her notebook. She looked at the spring supply list she'd been making. "That's paid work," Dora said. "Consulting separate from your position here." "Sutton offered fair money," I asked, "because I knew you'd want to know before you considered it." "How much?" Dora told her. Clara was quiet for a moment. That was more than a month's wages at the boarding house in Philadelphia, for what she estimated would be 2, maybe 3 days of work per ranch. "How'd you get involved in this?" she asked. "Because Sutton came to me and asked how to reach you without going through Gideon," Dora said, "which tells you something about how people see the situation and also about how much sense Frank Sutton has." She picked up her coffee. "He didn't want it to look like he was poaching Gideon's cook. He's not poaching me. I'd still be here, I know that. But the point stands." Dora looked at her over the rim of the cup. "You should talk to Gideon about it. I don't need his permission to take consulting work." "I know you don't. I said talk to him, not ask him." Dora set down her cup. "There's a difference." Clara looked at her. "He's going to want to support it," Dora said more quietly. "Let him." She talked to Gideon that evening after supper when the hands had cleared out and Wyatt had taken Maisie upstairs for her nightly argument about bedtime. She told him what Dora had said straightforwardly, the same way she told him most things. He listened without interrupting. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment, and she waited, because she had learned that his silences were thinking, not avoidance. 4 ranches, he said. To start. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "How many ranches are in this valley?" Dora counted 19 operating spreads of meaningful size. He looked at her. You've already thought about this. I think about most things before I say them. I know you do. He set the cup down. What do you want to do? She had been asking herself that question for the 24 hours since Dora had left, turning it over the way she turned over supply calculations, looking at it from every angle, testing it for what she was sure of and what she wasn't. I want to do the consulting work, she said. I'm good at it. And it matters. Ranches that go into winter disorganized lose money, and sometimes lose more than that, and I know how to fix it. Then do it. I want to be clear that it doesn't change what I'm doing here. Iron Mesa runs first. I'm not worried about that. You should also know that I've been thinking about something larger. She had not said this out loud yet. She had been holding it in her notebook, a page she'd started 3 weeks ago, and kept adding to in the evenings. A provisions business. Preserved goods. Dried soups. Trail food. Winter staples made to a consistent standard. Things I could prepare here or in a dedicated space and sell to ranches across the territory. Not just consulting actual product. The kitchen was quiet. Wrenfield Provisions, she said. It sounded strange said out loud, her own name on something. That's what I'd call it. Gideon looked at her for a long moment. She watched him thinking, really thinking, not the quick response of a man who had already decided what he wanted to say. You'd need a workspace, he said finally. The kitchen here can't do volume production and feed the ranch at the same time. There's the old equipment shed on the east side. It's solid, I looked at it. With a second stove and some shelving it would work. That's a significant outlay. I know. I'd take it as a loan against first-year revenue. Documented with terms. She held his gaze. I'm not asking for a gift. I know you're not. He picked up his cup, looked at it, set it down again. Clara, I'm not concerned about the money or the terms. I'm thinking about what this means. What does it mean? It means you're building something that's yours. Completely. He looked at her directly. Something you'd have whether you're at Iron Mesa or not. Yes, she said. That's the point. He was quiet for another moment. Then something settled in his face, a decision, she thought, or maybe a recognition. I think that's right, he said. I think you should have something that's entirely yours. He leaned forward slightly. And I think a man who wanted the opposite of that would be a fool. She looked at him. I'll help you draw up the loan terms, he said. And I'll clear the equipment shed in the spring. She let out a breath she hadn't entirely known she was holding. Thank you. Don't thank me. It's the right thing to do. He picked up his cup and finished his coffee and stood. You should write to Sutton tomorrow. Before someone else gets to his rancher friends first. She almost smiled. You sound like a businessman. I run a cattle operation. It's the same thing. He took his cup to the basin. Right to Sutton. Spring came and she went to Sutton's ranch first. Spent 2 days there, walking through his storerooms and his smokehouse and his root cellar, asking questions and making notes, and reorganizing what could be reorganized immediately, and writing out a plan for what needed to be built before the following winter. Sutton followed her around with the attentiveness of a man who had lost 40 head of cattle to a problem he now understood and was not going to let happen again. This is different from what I expected, he said on the second afternoon. What did you expect? I don't know. Someone telling me to buy more of things. He was watching her mark the rotation dates on the cellar shelves. You're telling me to buy differently, store differently, think differently about the whole thing. Buying more of things you're storing wrong just means more spoilage, she said. The point is to waste nothing. Iron Mesa doesn't waste anything. Not anymore. She wrote the last rotation date and stepped back. Did when I got there. He was quiet for a moment. Gideon's lucky, he said. That you stayed. She thought about Harold Finch on the platform, the envelope extended, the town's eyes on her. She thought about Dora's bench at the edge of the platform, and the small room above the feed store, and the 8-mile drive to a ranch that needed a cook. I needed work, she said. He needed someone who could do it. That's not luck. That's just how things fit sometimes. Sutton nodded slowly. Still, he said. She drove back to Iron Mesa on the second evening with her notebook full and her mind already on the next ranch. And the third day she was running the numbers in her head for the first production batch of dried soup mixture, which she had already tested twice in the Iron Mesa kitchen, and which kept well and reconstituted properly and was, she thought, genuinely good. Maisie was waiting on the porch when she pulled up. Kept the stove, she said. I know you did, Clara said. I smelled it from the road. This was not true. She could not smell the stove from the road, but Maisie's face did something wonderful. Clara climbed down from the wagon, feeling like the 2 days away had been, overall, worth coming back from. The equipment shed took most of April to clear and fit out. Wyatt did half the work without being asked, which was how Wyatt did most things now, appearing where the work was and doing it without announcement, as if the work were simply a thing that needed doing and he happened to be there. He and Hector built the shelving. Clara ordered the second stove from Red Willow's new general merchant, a woman named Bess Caraway, who had taken over the building Marsh had vacated, which Clara thought was a better use of the space, and Gideon and 2 of the hands installed it. The day it was finished, Clara stood in the doorway of the shed and looked at it. It was not pretty. It was a working space, plain and practical, with good shelving and 2 solid stoves and the kind of light through the east window that would be useful in the mornings. It smelled like new wood and the ghost of old equipment and possibility. Wyatt stood beside her. "It's good," he said. "It is." She looked at the shelving. "First production batch next week. Dried soup mixture and the trail biscuits. I want to help." She looked at him. He was 15 now. He'd had a birthday in February, quiet as Wyatt's birthdays apparently were, though Maisie had made a significant amount of noise about the cake. He had grown 2 inches since October, and was starting to have his father's look about him, the same careful face, the same quality of taking things in without giving much away. "You've got ranch work," she said. "Not all day. I can do mornings." She looked back at the shed. "I'll need someone who can handle the smoking process for the dried meats. The smokehouse method, but adapted for volume." She paused. "You know the smokehouse better than I do." "I know I do," he said, without any particular heat. Just the fact. She turned to look at him, and he was almost smiling, the almost smile she had seen more frequently in the past few months, the closed-down expression cracking at the edges and showing the person underneath. "Monday morning," she said. 4:30. "I'll be there." He walked off toward the barn, and Clara stood in the doorway of her shed and watched him go, and felt something she was going to have to put a name to eventually. Not yet. The first delivery went out in May. 12 crates of dried soup mixture, 8 of trail biscuits, 6 of smoked meat portions and fruit preserves, loaded into the wagon and driven to 3 ranches in the valley, with invoice and terms attached. Clara drove herself. She had thought about sending one of the hands but decided against it. This was Renfield Provisions' first delivery, and she was going to be present for it. The second ranch was Caldecott's place. He met her at the gate and looked at the crates and looked at her and then looked at the invoice. "It's fair pricing," he said. "I know it is. Fair but not cheap." "No, the cheap version doesn't keep through February." She held his gaze. "The version in those crates does. If you use it as intended and you run out before spring, I'll refund the cost of what's missing. That's in the terms." He looked at the invoice again. "You're guaranteeing the product. I'm guaranteeing my work. That's the only thing worth guaranteeing." He signed the invoice. On the drive back, she passed through Red Willow, and she stopped at Bess Caraway's store to pick up an order, and Bess came out from behind the counter to look at the empty crate space in the wagon and said, "First run?" "First run. How'd it go?" All 3 signed. Clara folded her receipt. "Word gets around." "It does in this valley." Bess leaned against the counter. "I heard Harmon's wife is interested in the consultation service too, for their summer kitchen setup. She can write to me at Iron Mesa." Bess looked at her with the frank assessment of one businesswoman looking at another. "You're building something real," she said. "Not a compliment exactly. More like a recognition." "That's the intention," Clara said. June came in warm and green and busy. The ranch work was at its peak, which meant the kitchen was feeding people at a volume and pace that left little room for anything else in the mornings. And the provisions business was growing faster than she'd planned, which meant the evenings were full of production work and correspondence, and the ongoing calculation of supply cost and margin. She was tired in a way she'd learned to work, with not the desperate exhaustion of that first month when everything was new and wrong, but the honest tiredness of a person doing more than one real thing and doing both of them seriously. Gideon noticed. She knew he noticed because he started appearing in the shed in the evenings, not to help exactly, not in any way that displaced her work, but to be in the room. He'd sit on the stool near the east window, with whatever paperwork he'd brought from the house, and work alongside her, in the way they'd worked alongside each other, at the kitchen table, through the winter. The shed had room for it, and the evenings were long in June, and she found that she liked having him there. One evening in mid-June, she looked up from her ledger and found him looking at her instead of at his paperwork. "What?" she said. "I've been trying to figure out how to say something." "Say it plainly," she said. "You're usually plain." "I'm trying to be plain." He set his paperwork aside. He was not turning his hat in his hand, she noticed that. He was holding himself very still, which was different, which meant he was not working through a decision. He'd already made it. "I want to ask you to marry me." The shed was quiet. Outside, the long June evening was still light. The sky that particular western blue that goes on past any reasonable hour. "I want to be clear about why," he said, "because I think you'll want me to be clear." "I do. Not because of the children. Maisie and Wyatt are there better than they were, and that's partly you, but they're not the reason I'm asking." He looked at her steadily. "Not because of the ranch. The ranch is running fine. Better than it was, and that's your work. But the ranch isn't the reason either." She waited. "I'm asking because I've spent 9 months noticing when you're in a room and when you're not," he said. "Because you're the most capable and honest person I've met in a long time, and I find that," he paused, working for the word compelling, "isn't right. More than that. I think you're remarkable, Clara. And I think you know yourself well enough that I don't have to tell you that you are. But I want to say it anyway." He held her gaze. "I want to spend the rest of my life in whatever room you're in." She sat with that for a moment. She was not a woman who romanticized things she had learned early, that romanticizing was a way of not seeing clearly, and she valued clear sight above most things. But she was also not a woman who denied what was in front of her, and what was in front of her was a serious, weathered, honest man who had answered his own door when he might not have, who had given her ledgers and a shed and space to build something that was entirely hers, who had never once in 9 months looked at her body the way Harold Finch had on that platform, like a problem, like a disappointment, like a thing that fell short. He had looked at her work. He had looked at her mind. He had looked at her. "I have conditions," she said. Something moved in his face relief, she thought, or the edge of it. "All right. Renfield Provision stays mine, completely. That doesn't fold into Iron Mesa's accounts. I already told you I wouldn't want it to. I want it in writing. Done. And I want it understood that I make my own decisions about the business. You can have opinions. You can tell me when you think I'm wrong. The final call is mine." "That's how it should work," he said. "I'd want the same for the ranch. Fair." She set her ledger on the shelf. "And I want Wyatt at the table." He looked at her. "Not for this conversation," she said, "but whatever comes next. I want him knowing his opinion matters. He's been doing the work of a man for a year and being treated like a difficult child for longer than that." She paused. "He's not difficult. He's just serious. And serious people need to know they're seen." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. "I've been seeing it. I've been not doing well enough at saying so." "Then do better." I will." She looked at him for a long moment. The last of the evening light was coming through the east window, and the shed smelled like wood and smoked meat, and the dried herbs she had hanging in bundles from the rafters. And she thought that this was about as far from a train platform in October as a person could get. "Yes," she said. He let out a breath. "Yes," she said again. "Ask me plainly, and I'll say it plainly." He stood up from the stool, and he crossed the shed, and he looked at her from 2 feet away, close enough that she could see the lines around his eyes and the gray at his temples and the specific quality of his face when he wasn't composing it for anyone. "Clara Wrenfield, will you marry me?" "Yes," she said. "I will." Wyatt's reaction was not what she expected. She had thought he might take it quietly, process it in the private way he processed most things, come around to it eventually. She had not thought he would appear in the kitchen doorway at 7 in the morning, 2 days after she and Gideon had told the children, with an expression she had never seen on his face before open, slightly uncertain, the expression of a person about to say something they're not entirely sure how to say. "I want to say something," he said. She was making biscuits. Kept making them. "Go ahead." He came in and stood at the counter a few feet away. He looked at the dough for a moment. "When you got here," he said, "I wasn't good to you. You weren't. He stopped. "I was looking for reasons it wouldn't work, so I wouldn't have to." He stopped again. "So you wouldn't have to want it to work and then lose it," she said. He looked at her. "You'd already lost Rosa," she said. "You didn't want to do that again." His jaw worked. He looked away at the wall. "Yeah," he said roughly. She kept working the dough. "I'm not going anywhere, Wyatt. I know that now." You knew it before. You were just scared. She glanced at him sideways. That's allowed. Scared is a reasonable response to losing things. He was quiet for a moment. Then very low, I'm glad you stayed. She set the dough down. She looked at him, this 15-year-old boy who had counted flour in secret and kept her smokehouse knowledge and slept against a shack wall in a blizzard and made a seating plan that was frankly smarter than what she would have come up with. I am too, she said. For the record, I was also glad when you showed me your flour count. That was good thinking. It was obvious. Obvious thinking that nobody else did, she said. There's no such thing as obviously obvious. If it were, everyone would do it. He thought about that. Huh, he said. Go to the smokehouse, she said. The morning batch needs checking. He went. She put the biscuits in the oven and listened to the kitchen for a moment, the sounds of the ranch waking up around her, Maisie's feet overhead, the hands coming in from the bunkhouse, the particular rhythm of a working morning at Iron Mesa. She had built this. Not alone, nothing was ever built alone, and she knew better than to pretend otherwise. Gideon had given her the door. Wyatt had given her his flour count. Maisie had kept the stove. Dora had offered a bench and a back room, and 20 years of watching Red Willow closely enough to see what others missed. But she had walked through that door. She had done the work. She had stayed when staying was hard and quiet and unwitnessed, in the months before anyone had a reason to notice. That part had been hers. The wedding was in July, under the cottonwoods at the east edge of the property where the creek bent, and the ground was level, and the trees were old enough to be worth standing under. Dora Pittman was there. Frank Sutton came with his wife. Bess Caraway Hector, and most of the ranch hands filled out the space under the trees. A few of the Red Willow townsfolk came too, not the ones who had laughed at the station, or at least not all of them. People's opinions revised themselves when revision was warranted, and Clara had given this valley considerable warrant. She did not wear white. She wore a dress she had made in June from good cloth in a deep rust red, practical enough to move in and better looking than most things she had owned in her life. She had made it herself because she was good with her hands, and because she was not going to trust someone else to get the cut right for a body like hers. Wyatt stood beside Gideon. Maisie walked ahead of Clara carrying her mother's recipe book instead of flowers. Because Maisie had asked to, and Clara had said yes without hesitation, the book with its cracked spine and penciled margins, and her mother's voice in every careful line. The thing she'd carried 3,000 miles on a train to a man who wouldn't take it. The ranch hands had handled the food entirely, which they did with the competitive seriousness of men who had been watching good cooking for 9 months and had absorbed more than they'd admitted. The results were imperfect in the way that cooking by committee is always imperfect, and Clara ate all of it and said it was good and meant it. Gideon's hand was warm in hers when they stood together under the cottonwoods. He said what he'd been asked to say, and she said what she'd been asked to say, and then the efficient was done, and the hands started making noise, and Maisie said finally, in a voice that carried farther than she'd intended, which made Wyatt press his mouth together in the way that meant he was laughing and not going to admit it. There is a thing that people get wrong about women like Clara Wrenfield. They think the story is about being overlooked, about being dismissed because of something as shallow as the shape of a body, and then proving through exceptional circumstances that you were worth something after all. That's not the story. The story is about what a person does on an ordinary Tuesday, when nobody is watching and nothing exceptional is happening. It's about counting the flour barrel in September when the numbers don't add up, and you're not sure what it means yet. It's about getting back on a horse in a blizzard after you've fallen off. It's about staying in a kitchen that isn't yours yet, and making it good anyway, not because someone is going to notice, but because the work itself is worth doing. Clara had not proved herself in one dramatic moment. She had proved herself in hundreds of small, unremarkable ones, most of which nobody saw. The blizzard rescue was real, and the dinner that collapsed Crow's scheme was real, and those moments mattered. But they were built on months of 4:15 mornings and flour counts and biscuit dough and ledger columns, and the particular patience of a woman who had been told her whole life that she was not quite right and had decided, somewhere along the way, that she would rather be useful than acceptable. Part nobody tells you about that decision is that's not made once. It's made every day, sometimes every hour, in the small moments when it would be easier to be smaller. Clara made it every day. By the following spring, Wrenfield Provisions was supplying 11 ranches in the valley. By the year after that, she had hired 2 women to help with production, one from Red Willow, one from a homestead east of Sutton's place, and the equipment shed had been extended twice. The work had a life of its own now, a reputation that traveled further than she had, orders coming in by mail from ranches she'd never visited. She still made breakfast at Iron Mesa at 5:30 every morning, not because she had to, because she wanted to. Because the table where Gideon drank his coffee and Wyatt ate his biscuits too fast, and Maisie asked questions about the ocean and the chemistry of bread, and whether chickens had feelings, that table was hers, in a way that had nothing to do with legal terms and everything to do with having built it, slowly and imperfectly, out of the most ordinary materials available. Work, honesty, time, staying when staying was hard. Maisie learned to cook properly, which meant she learned to be patient with processes that couldn't be rushed, which turned out to be useful in ways that extended far beyond the kitchen. Wyatt took over the smokehouse operation entirely by the time he was 17 and ran it with the same quiet exactness he brought to everything. And Clara sometimes stood in the doorway and watched him and thought about the boy who had handed her a folded paper with flour counts on it and waited to see if she was worth showing it to. She hoped she had been worth it. She suspected the answer by now was yes. Gideon asked her once, late in the second year, when they were sitting on the porch on a summer evening with the valley spread out in front of them, and the kind of quiet that comes from a day of work done, and nothing urgent requiring attention. He asked her when she had decided to stay. She thought about it honestly. Before I got to the ranch, she said. I decided on the drive out. Before I'd seen the kitchen or met the children or known whether you'd turn me away from the door. She looked out at the valley. I decided I wasn't getting back on any train. He was quiet for a moment. What made you decide that? Harold Finch handed me an envelope with money in it, she said. And I thought about who I'd be if I took it. And who would you have been? Someone who let other people decide what she was worth. He said nothing. He reached over and took her hand, which he did sometimes in the evenings, not demonstratively, not making anything of it, just the quiet fact of his hand around hers in the summer dark. She let herself have it. This was not the life she had written letters toward, not the arranged thing with the man who had described Montana winters and how a ranch without a woman in it felt hollow. That life had lasted about 3 minutes on a train platform, and she did not miss it. This was the life she had walked herself into, step by practical step, carrying a battered suitcase and a recipe book and $43, and the stubborn conviction that useful work done honestly was worth more than anyone's approval. She had been right about that. She was right about most things she thought carefully enough about. Gideon would tell you that himself if you asked him. He would smile the real smile, the one that had stopped being rare somewhere around the 3rd month, and he would say that the question he asked on the first day was the wrong question. Can you cook? The right question, it turned out, was, what can't you do? And the answer, as Iron Mesa had learned in the most concrete possible terms, was a considerably shorter list than anyone standing on that train platform in October would have guessed.